Chapter 1502. Published at 27th of December, 2022, 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1502. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel dove out of the way, a hair-raising feeling of danger drilling into his mind as the primitive man's instincts roared at him for the first time in a long while. Without hesitation, Lionel rolled out of the tree, his palm flipping over to reveal his self-made bow. Even as he fell from the tree, his gaze grew cold. He pulled the bowstring taut, his vision finding the one line of sight through the thickness of the trees. At that moment, the location he had just been sitting in suddenly imploded. It looked as though someone had planted a bomb into the core of the tree, only to trigger it right this instant. However, Lionel knew better. This was definitely related to the attention of the old man. Lionel took a breath, releasing his arrow and a breath all at once. Swift. The arrow shot through the air as though on rocket fuel. The sound of whistling wind didn't even reach Lionel's ears until Lit had already appeared before the old man's brows. No one even registered the beautiful curve the attack took through the trees. In fact, Lionel, who had begun falling from the tree, had still not even hit the ground yet. If one thought that the only weapon force that Lionel had strengthened during the last year was his spear force, you would be sorely mistaken. Even if the application wasn't the same, with Lionel's feel for the bow, his ability to translate his findings felt almost as natural as breathing. His talent in the bow seemed to be on a level all to its own. The old man was caught off guard. However, his vision alone seemed to carry some explosive strength all to itself. The moment he locked onto the arrow, even if it was in the final moment, it too imploded. However, the arrow had gotten so close to him that the explosion obstructed his vision, allowing Lionel to vanish from his sight. One would have thought that Lionel would take the opportunity to run, but almost as soon as he took the advantage, Lionel pressed Dream Class Sniper Archer. Lionel fired 3 more arrows before he even touched the ground, his bow force blazing with life and vitality. Each seemed to carry with it its own flair, reaching a level of freedom and unrestrained power that even Lionel's spear seemed to lack. But it was only right that things were like this. Lionel's bow force was being forcefully restrained to the 5th dimension from the 6th, while his spear force had yet to take that step. To an outside observer, though, this would still be a shock. One was supported by spear domain while the other was not. This should have closed the gap. And yet, Lionel's bow force seemed to have still left his spear force in the dust. The 3 arrows appeared within the ground in the blink of an eye, all 3 fluttering like soaring birds and curving toward the burly man. Lionel landed on the ground, his gaze sharp as he brandished another arrow. These 3 days he hadn't just been casually wasting time. Whenever he found a suitable branch, he would snap it off and form another arrow. In this time, he had already formed hundreds for a situation just like this one. The burly man, whose first instinct was to protect the old man even though the latter didn't need it, couldn't believe that he was actually the target. He reacted quickly, brandishing his spear toward the first coming arrow, feeling that the 2 trailing behind it were less of a threat. But to his horror, the moment he pierced out with a strike he had practiced no less than 10,000 times, he actually missed. The arrow fluttered, slowing down a measure. In the grand scheme, it was akin to a car racing down the highway easing up from 100 kilometers an hour to 95, but in a battle this high level, such a sudden and abrupt change was enough to change everything. Thwack! The arrow pierced into the burly man's collarbone, throwing off his ability to be able to deal with the remaining 2 arrows. One pierced into his knee, ruining his mobility. The other tore into the soft side of his elbow, removing his ability to brandish his spear with both hands. Lionel, though, was still shocked by the outcome. Those arrows should have gone through the burly man's body entirely. And yet, it had sounded like he just stuck them into a solid tree. Just how strong was this person's body? Even Lionel, who had the Morales family's metal body technique, wasn't so sturdy, at least not without releasing both his divine armor and bronze runes. And even then he wouldn't be able to match up. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't get to linger on the thought for long, because he knew the vision of the old man would clear right this moment. He was already prepared, releasing the string of his arrow again. But just as he was about to, his fingers paused. He could see it quite clearly. The old man was incredibly pale-faced, hints of blood falling down his cheeks like streaking tears. Lionel knew right then that even if the old man wanted to act again, he wouldn't be able to. Still, he kept his senses primed, walking forward slowly. He had taken advantage of the situation to deal with the burly man, so this was a chance he shouldn't give him. He wasn't sure if this small village had anyone else so powerful, but his deductions told him that the answer to that question was no. If there were, it was unlikely for someone with the status the old man seemed to have to come out to greet them personally. If Lionel was correct, then all of this village's strongest existences were right here. At that moment, the small group watched in horror as Lionel slowly walked out of the forest's edge, his bow still raised. If he was so effective from 500 meters away, none of them dared to imagine just what kind of monster he would be at this closer range. There was no way any of them could deal with such a thing. Chapter 1503. Published at 27th of December, 2022, 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1503. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The old man breathed heavily, a concentrated look in his eyes. He seemed to be trying very hard to recover, so that he could attack again. But something about the coldness in Lionel's eyes seemed to tell him that he would be prepared for this. In fact, he seemed to feel that Lionel was untouchable. The burly man roared. Limping on one leg, he dove at Lionel, brandishing his spear with one arm. But just as he was about to skewer Lionel through, his spear burst into a rain of ash. Losing his spear and without hitting the target he thought he would, the burly man fell forward, hitting the ground cheek first and skidding to a stop at Lionel's feet. When the old man saw this, his eyes opened as wide as saucers. Under the astonished gazes of the hunter squadron, and the few who had come out of the village after hearing the commotion, the old man fell to his knees. Esteemed nobleman, please forgive my ignorance. He kowtowed as hard as he could, his forehead smashing into the ground repeatedly. Despite the fact that this location was mostly soft soil, the old man was so vehement that his forehead eventually split into a bloody wound. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Was this reaction because of his spear domain? Or was it something else? If Lionel didn't know better, he would think that he had somehow stumbled into the tribulation of his spear domain heirloom. He had found it very weird these past few days that he hadn't run into anyone from the Void Palace. Usually, when one entered a subdimensional zone, you were all taken to the very same place. When Lionel and Aina entered the Paris zone, they appeared in a village together. When Lionel entered the Camelot zone with the Slayer Legion, the only reason he had been able to go off on his own was that he entered first, and then used his self-created craft to hide underground when the others appeared. Regardless of the situation, everyone who entered together always appeared together. It simply didn't make any sense that Lionel was on his own like this. So he had assumed that something else went wrong. Maybe his spear domain heirloom was triggered again, moving his tribulation up even further. It felt possible since everyone he ran into seemed to use a spear as well. But Lionel wasn't willing to conclude this. For one, the spear was an innately common weapon to begin with, especially in a more primitive setting like this one. People like to call the sword the first weapon, but the truth was that the first weapon, if not the rock, was most definitely the spear. Plus, there was also the matter of the sheer number of individuals that had entered. Lionel couldn't ignore the fact that the basic functions of this zone had been ruined by the oddity of their appearance within it. "Stop," Lionel said coolly, speaking their language as though he had always been able to do this. It was only when Lionel said this that the old man paused. But even then the latter didn't raise his head, not daring to look up for fear of what might happen next. "What is your name?" Lionel asked. "My name is Farley, nobleman." Lionel narrowed his eyes. He just wanted to test the bottom line of these people, and also ensure that he had grasped their language as well as he thought he had. "Where is this place, Farley? I've lost my way. Where is the fastest route back?" Lionel wasn't specific with his words on purpose. Any ignorance on his part, if shown in too great a quantity, might result in this situation going south. Before then, Lionel had to make sure he secured as much information as possible. It made sense for a so-called nobleman like him to not know this place. It was a small village, nearby a stream of water, in the middle of a forest. It was doubtful that a person of high standing would know this place like the back of their hand. Sir, Slail City is 2 days' journey southeast of here. Trith City is a day and a half's journey northwest of here. And Sing City is 3 days' journey west of here. Farley did his best to recall everything and gave all the information he knew of, not holding back. Since Lionel wasn't specific, he just told him everything, hoping one of these cities was Lionel's own. He couldn't help but hold his breath when he saw Lionel's lack of a response. Inwardly, Lionel was frowning. This wasn't because of the information, he had no reason not to trust it. Rather, it was that this little village seemed too weird. Southeast, northwest, and even west itself. This village was entirely surrounded by cities, so why did these people choose to stay here? It was a bit odd. It wasn't like traveling was the issue. These weren't particularly long journeys in the grand scheme of things. Also, danger shouldn't have been a problem either. After following the hunter squad around, it was easy for Lionel to make these sort of deductions. The population of beasts wasn't ridiculously high. In fact, their village didn't even have heavy defenses, there wasn't even a wall around them. So it was relatively safe, the distance wasn't too far, there were several cities to choose from, and yet they all chose to remain here? It wasn't that Lionel didn't believe that some would prefer to live in a more rural area, but when he thought about the split sort of reaction he received, one seething with hatred and the other worshipful as though he was a deity descended from the skies, his brows couldn't help but furrow. Lionel shook his head. "Give me some spices and I'll be on my way." Farley kowtowed again and did as Lionel asked, almost handing over way too much. After casually helping the burly man heal, Lionel turned toward the direction of Trith City, the closest of the three, and vanished. Chapter 1504. Published at 27th of December, 2022, 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1504. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel grilled meat in one hand, and seasoned it with the other. His Radiant Force and Scarlet Star Force might have been powerful fire forces, but they were no good at cooking. One was radioactive, and the other was intent on destroying everything in its path. So for something like this, Lionel could only use regular fire force. But it was more difficult than he thought it would be. Lionel had never really struggled with pulling atmospheric force toward himself, until he stepped foot into the Void Palace. By then, the anarchic force was so dense that using atmospheric force was mostly a pipe dream. This was a large part of why Lionel had still rarely used his Scarlet Star Force, even after awakening the ability to pull it toward him on a whim. Lionel had thought that he wouldn't need to worry about it anymore while he was in this place since there was no anarchic force. But just like with all the other oddities, he still struggled. Back when he was practically dying of thirst, he had to approach a river to find dense enough water force to satiate himself. Usually he would be able to call upon water force whenever he wanted now, thanks to his divine armor. But if he did that here, he would be lucky to form a single drop. Pa-and-D. In OVE1 this matter stretched to other things as well. For example, Lionel concluded that the reason his arrows hadn't been devastating was that he had shot from too far away. Previously, shooting from 500 meters away, so long as anarchic force wasn't present, was as easy as breathing. But in this place his bow force actually weakened so much over this distance. Now, his previous 500-meter range was about equivalent to his current 100 to 75-meter range. He would definitely have to adjust. Unfortunately, the problems just kept coming. After a day and a half, Lionel had still not spotted the city. His first thought was that the old man had lied to him, but Lionel frowned at such a possibility. He was very good at reading people. Even though he couldn't be considered to be a lie detector, he still didn't believe that Farley would have even dared to lie to him in the first place. Is it possible? A thought flashed in Lionel's eyes. He didn't consider for a moment that he had deviated from the right path. His sense of direction was too solid. He did consider the possibility that the old man's sense of direction wouldn't be as strong as his own. Plus, if the city was just a little bit off the cardinal direction the old man had stated, Lionel could end up way off. Still, Lionel thought that it was likely the hidden third open. And over 3 more days after the initial day and a half estimate, he finally saw it looming ahead. As expected, the estimates for speed the old man had given were based on what he thought of Lionel, a realization that made the latter especially serious. Obviously, Lionel hadn't gone all out during the past several days, and even took a lot of time to check around for clues and signs of human life, just in case he had veered off course. However, for Farley to underestimate his speed by 3 times, just how strong were these noblemen? And what would Lionel do now that he was here? Up ahead, an enormous city loomed. It was like a steel behemoth, its walls flashing with silvery lights, and only the tallest buildings within being barely visible from Lionel's vantage point. However, very quickly, Lionel realized that the city was much further away than he thought it was. It was just that the city was so large that it had taken a moment for his perception to adjust. When he calculated how large it must be, his brows couldn't help but shoot up. Lionel entered stealth mode, becoming even more focused than he had been before. If Farley could see through him before, it was clear that his previous attempts hadn't been nearly good enough. Of course, Lionel had gotten complacent after 3 days as well, not to mention the fact that he had been hungry. But now he was in top shape. Lionel didn't understand enough about this situation to enter the city so freely. He had to observe a bit first. As Lionel got closer, he realized he was still several dozen kilometers away. This wouldn't normally be an issue with his speed, but the main problem was that the number of beasts seemed to increase rather than lessen. At the same time, the force in the air seemed to also thicken. When Lionel finally managed to enter a kilometer range, his eyes couldn't help but widen. The entire city. No, it was only accurate to say that the portions of the city that Lionel could see were surrounded by an abyss. Chains connected the open city gates. Just from Lionel's point of view, there were 3. Each chain link was tens of meters across and their thickness didn't need to be mentioned. Those that wanted to enter the city crossed these paths, risking what seemed like life and limb just for a chance. And from what it seemed, there were even some that were turned away at the entrance and forced to go back. Lionel watched as several fell to their deaths. Some had even been close but were assaulted by an unlucky rush of powerful wind. What kind of city is this? Lionel was at a loss. Was it worth risking life and death to enter? There were some that didn't seem to need to risk as much to enter. These individuals procured the help of large snake beasts that coiled their bodies around the chains to slither forward, swaying along with the chains. From what Lionel had seen, not a single ground escorted by one of these snakes had died. However, it seemed to be very expensive to gain such a service. In addition, it was mostly a route taken by individuals who seemed to be merchants. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if they gained a large discount for their efforts. Just as Lionel was thinking about whether or not the risk would be worth it, he froze. Right then, a merchant carriage rolled to the edge of the abyss. Unlike the other carriages, this one pulled along a cage on wheels. What made Lionel freeze was that within these cages, beaten and ragged, were Noah and Miguel. Lionel's gaze flickered with rage. Chapter 1505. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1505. Who could? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This scene confirmed to Lionel that he definitely wasn't in the spear domain zone. However, aside from that small bit of assurance, there was nothing else to be happy about. He couldn't say that he cared very much for Miguel, but he didn't hate him either. The two just had their own separate perspectives on certain matters. Lionel wouldn't just watch as Miguel was taken into what clearly seemed to be slavery without doing anything. And even if Lionel had no intention of saving Miguel, and he turned a blind eye to it all, he couldn't possibly leave his cousin alone like this, right? Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. P1E's visit N0VE1BN. Any. His gaze shifted toward the bridge, and then the city. What little information he had told him that his best chance at saving these two was to act right this moment. With such a large city, with such a menacing atmosphere, Lionel was certain that whoever was in charge was a monster in their own right. Lionel hadn't even been confident in taking down the warrior of a little village without using some tricks. And if not for his sharp senses and quick reaction time, he would have lost his life to the old man. Yet it was all too obvious to him that they feared these so-called noblemen down to the deepest depths of their bones. Even without seeing the strongest of this world, Lionel knew from this alone that they weren't to be trifled with. And since these slave traffickers were acting in broad daylight, it was clearly within the rules of the city for them to act as such. This meant that Lionel wouldn't have morality on his side either. Plus, even if Lionel didn't have any of these reference points, just the fact that whoever had targeted the Void Palace dared to swallow up their seventh-dimensional powerhouses into this place as well meant that, in all likelihood, there were individuals here more than capable of dealing with such existences. There was always a possibility that this wasn't the case, but if the seventh-dimensional existences of the Void Palace could truly move freely, they would have long since made a huge commotion to gather up all the students to think of a plan. The fact they hadn't spoke volumes. Lionel's jaw clenched, his gaze flickering back and forth between several crucial points. I'm 100% confident in crossing the chain bridge, but fighting on it would be impossible. There's a 50-50 shot that I fall if I start a battle there, so it'll have to be before they begin crossing. But if I attack before then? No, this is really the only choice. Lionel took a breath, his gaze turning frighteningly cold. His mind was only filled with one thought. If Noah and Miguel could be taken in like this, what about everyone else? How many had been taken into slavery like this? And what about Aina? Just die. Lionel was decisive. The moment he made his choice, he rose to his feet high in the trees and fired. Before anyone could realize what was happening, 3 heads were skewered through. Lionel had learned his lesson from the last time. 500 meters was much too far away, but this time, he was only 100 meters away. At this distance, his lethality was on a whole other level. Clang. Lionel's gaze flickered when his arrow failed to shatter the lock of the cage, but his hands didn't falter. He had already accounted for such a possibility. He didn't believe that his cousin or Miguel had been stagnant during the year it had been since he saw them. The fact they were captured spoke not only to the strength of their captors, but also their means. In the brief instant of Lionel's failed assault, the attention of several turned toward his location. If there was one weakness of being a sniper, it was that every shot would expose more information about your whereabouts. In this environment, Lionel couldn't curve his shots very much without using 6-dimensional force. So after 4, many had already triangulated his position. A powerful aura came crashing down on Lionel from above, but the latter's sharp gaze didn't waver. He knew where these powerful auras were coming from. One was from the man he assumed was an overseer of the city. He was the one who had spoken with the carriage leader and brokered a deal between them and the city. The second was the carriage leader himself. The former wore what looked like a military uniform made of soft fabrics and covered in pockets and simple lines. But the latter was dressed like a wealthy businessman. If not for Lionel's sharp eyes, he would have never known that he was a powerful existence, to begin with. It was clear in an instant. The pressure these two gave off made the burly man of the village look like a joke. However, the fury in Lionel's eyes only grew. He could see it in their eyes. They were actually angry with him for trying to free slaves. He would have respected them more if they took this matter in stride, accepting that this was a normal part of the business they partook in. But from their gazes, it was clear that they felt like they had an ingrained right to do as they pleased. Such people, quite frankly, disgusted Lionel. At that moment, the seal in Lionel's left kidney shattered, breaking through several layers all at once. From the size of half a fingernail, it grew to about half the size of a large grape, flooding Lionel's body with scarlet star force and turning his pale violet eyes into a liquid red gold. The 5th arrow was already prepared as Lionel's eyes flickered with dancing destruction runes, each more elaborate than the last. Since he had trouble pulling from the atmosphere in this place, he would just pull from his own innate node. Who could stop him? Lionel's fingers released his bowstring, a streak of crimson cutting through the air in its wake. Chapter 1506. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 1506. Shocking ability. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The eyes of the businessman and overseer widened, a spike of danger twisting into their hearts as they felt their lives flash before their eyes. They thought that they had already understood the strength of the attacker, but for this mysterious person's strength to suddenly skyrocket to this level, bang! The lock of the cage shattered. Flames raced across the bars like a disease or a curse, flashing with complex runes as they ruined the structural integrity of the metal. In one moment, the cage felt like it was impregnable. In the next, it crumbled to ash, whistling in the wind as though it was nothing more than the fluttering leaves of a dying tree. When the businessman and overseer realized that they weren't the target of the arrow, they inwardly breathed a sigh of relief, but their expressions became ugly not long later. However, in response, Lionel shot 3 more arrows, each twisting toward a vital point of their bodies. While none of these arrows were powerful by Scarlet Star Force, the application of forceful to their bodies made them carry the strength of a shotgun. The wind clapped like thunder under the speeding arrows, the release of Lionel's bowstring sounding no different from an iron ball tearing a path out of a cannon. Miguel's expression flickered. How could he not be familiar with Scarlet Star Force? With the rarity of the Force, and the fact the person wielding it was trying to save them, he would be a fool to not think of Lionel. Truthfully, Miguel had a lot of reasons to hate Lionel. After all, because of Lionel, his years of effort and accumulated strength at the quasi-6th dimension was all ruined. Without Lionel's innate node, he had to find a completely different path to enter the 6th-dimensional God path. And as such, he was actually growing weaker by the day instead of stronger. However, Miguel never really took this personally, he just took it as him being unlucky. Whether he won the fight against Lionel or not, he would have still given Lionel his innate node back. The main reason he hadn't earlier was that it would have left him too injured to fight in the first place. Seeing Lionel now, though, left him with a whole host of complicated feelings. Still, these complicated feelings didn't slow his movements in the slightest. Miguel and Noah sprung action at once. Though their hands and feet were both bound, the two were experts in their own right. The chains that bound their ankles were 2 feet apart, and were linked to the chains that bound their wrists. Still, they were able to begin running with a crouch and short steps. The two of them weren't the only ones in the carriage. In fact, there were others of the Void Palace inside as well. However, it was only the two of them who recognized Lionel without laying eyes on him, and as such shot in his direction without hesitation. Seeing their reaction, many subconsciously followed while others broke off in different directions, hoping to take advantage of the situation. With most focused on a single path, there might be less people who chased after them. Lionel continued to cover their retreat, his arrows peppering the guards, businessman and overseer to the point they couldn't even begin to run after the escapees. Each one of Lionel's arrows was menacing and placed in an awkward position. He aimed for their eyes, their knees, their feet, even their crotches. He held nothing back, assaulting them with numbers. Fuck. He can't use it anymore, charge forward. The overseer's skin suddenly flashed with a metallic light. His hands snapped outward as though he was throwing daggers, but he had nothing in his palms at all. To Lionel's shock, though, layers of the overseer's skin peeled off, attaching to the thick trees in the surroundings. Soon, the overseer shot forward, bouncing between the trees at a speed that was almost impossible to track. Between bounces, he would throw out more silver discs, attaching them to more and more trees. He flew forward like a speeding bullet, his body becoming a large streak of silver. It took no more than a single breath for him to cut the distance between himself and the nearest escapee to less than 5 meters. Lionel was stunned by what he was seeing. He could tag this ability to a specific ability index, and it even seemed like a combination of many of them, including Alan's magnet ability index. However, that was all. The overseer might be far faster than Lionel now, but his movement had also become far more predictable. Facing an enemy like Lionel, he had basically just sealed his fate. Lionel didn't even take a breath of time to calculate, his fingers having already released. The overseer suddenly panicked. He released that with the way Lionel's arrow had curved, he was adding to its force with his own momentum. Even if Lionel didn't use Scarlet Star Force again. Thwack. The overseer was pierced through the forehead, the head of Lionel's arrow tearing into his skull, just as the body of the arrow exploded into countless pieces. With a heavy thump, the overseer crashed into the tree he was magnetically attached to. There was such speed and force behind it that the tree cracked, beginning to slowly fall forward. Lionel frowned slightly. This was a bit of a problem. He took a breath, sixth-dimensional force spinning around his arrow as he released it. It tore through skies so quickly that there was absolute silence even after it crashed into its target. P1E's visit N0VE1BN. In T-bang. The arrow curled around, smashing into the side of the tree. An explosion sounded. A huge chunk of the bark and trunk imploded until it looked as though a giant had taken a giant bite out of it. The falling tree deviated, stopping its forward momentum, and beginning to fall back into the side. The pursuing guards, businessmen and lagging overseers suddenly found the behemoth-like shadow of a tree quickly falling toward them, their faces contorting in shock. Chapter 1507. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1507. Not enough information if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Heavy breathing filled the depths of the forest as a group of escapees gathered around one another and leaned on the thickness of the trees around them. At that moment, Lionel appeared at the treetops, his face still obscured by a blinding golden light. Seeing such a thing, Miguel and Noah frowned for a moment, but after realizing the potential issues, their brows relaxed. As the saying went, when smart people met together, there wasn't a need for so many words. The three of them very quickly came to a tacit understanding. Where are you all from? Lionel spoke in the language of the village people. Very quickly, he could see who among them grew confused and who among them responded with acknowledgement. It was just that easy for Lionel to tell who came from the Void Palace and who didn't. Aside from Miguel and Noah, there seemed to be three others. Still, this wasn't 100% factual. For all Lionel knew, there were different dialects. But from what he had observed around the city, at least in this region, everyone should speak the same language. Lionel received many answers to his questions, much of which he couldn't really understand. They spoke of landmarks and locations he had never heard of, but they did so with confidence, so it was obvious that these were likely common places everyone knew about. After hearing their words, Lionel went through everyone one by one and began to destroy their shackles. It was more delicate work than breaking the cage had been, harder too, but since Lionel could use his hands, it wasn't that big of a problem. Their gazes toward me turn a lot more worshipful the more I use my abilities. It seems like I was right about some stuff. Lionel could have shot more than one arrow of Scarlet Star Force, however. He had purposely chosen not to, his mind thinking of the old man that had tired out after using his ability just twice. Although there wasn't much information, nor enough data points, if Lionel was correct, as he usually was, this world likely separated itself into people with powerful abilities and those without. And it was likely that the marker for powerful abilities was whether it could manifest itself in some sort of outward projection of force or not. In addition, though this was a greater stretch and a conclusion that Lionel was more doubtful of, there seemed to be more restrictions on abilities in this place as well. These restrictions likely weren't a product of their birth, but rather the world itself. This place was more stifling than even a pinnacle seventh-dimensional world flooded with anarchic force. In such an environment, the suppression of ability indexes was also exceptional. N0? ELBI? NET. If it wasn't for Lionel's ability strengthening in the Raypack's nest, even his own ability index would have fallen to tier 3 or even worse in this place, let alone the average person. As such, in a place like this one, those that could display powerful abilities were even rarer than they were back in Lionel's dimensional verse. And as a result of this, there was an even clearer dividing line between the talented and untalented, even to the point there was slavery here. Still, this left more questions than answers. Where was this place? What point in history did it represent? The human domain didn't have such a powerful world anywhere. Could it be a snippet of the future? Was this a variant zone? It was possible. A variant zone appeared when a world was at a crossroads, and it was a chance to turn things around for the better. But a variant zone was also known for its low difficulty. What about this place was easy, exactly? And where were the rewards? Plus, a variant zone wouldn't be styled after a real world. At least not usually. It would be more like a challenge or a game, left behind by future generations who didn't like how things had turned out. This was why the only variant zone Lionel had ever heard of was found on terrain, and entered by Aina. That wasn't to say that a variant zone couldn't be like this, but it wasn't the most efficient use of resources for a world likely on its last legs, to begin with. Then the only logical conclusion seemed to be that this was a zone not from the human domain, but another domain entirely. But in that case, why was it that everyone here was human? Even the powerhouses who ran the city seemed to also be human. From what Lionel had learned from Wise Star Order, it wasn't that humans didn't exist in other domains. It was rather that they were instead treated like second-class citizens. However, clearly there were humans in power in this place. Unless there was another tier of overseers that Lionel hadn't seen and humans were actually selling their own to their other race overlords, this conclusion seemed unlikely as well. Then what was the truth? Quite frankly, Lionel had no idea. After freeing them all, Lionel was profusely thanked and he didn't stop any of them from leaving. However, he did take the opportunity to secretly tag some of them, tracking their location for a while both so that he could place a mental mark on the locations they spoke about, and for a more unfortunate reason. Once they were all gone, Lionel was left with just the Void Palace members, but he still wasn't quite sure if he should reveal his face just yet. If this was truly a hopeless situation, that would mean that this would essentially be their world now until they died. In that case, he couldn't trust anyone even if they were formerly from the Void Palace. Once despair sunk in, who knew what people would do? You five don't seem to be able to understand me? Lionel trusted in the genius of the Void Palace disciples. After so many days, he didn't believe that they wouldn't have picked up at least some of the language even if they lacked his processing speed. After several attempts, though, Noah eventually said something that left Lionel in silence. Body. Weak. No. Force. Lionel's eyes narrowed. What was going on? Chapter 1508. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 27 seconds p.m. Chapter 1508. Touching? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Was Noah trying to say that he couldn't use force? Honestly, while the group was running, Lionel had noted that they hadn't used force. Although Miguel had lost the speed branch after stepping past the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor, Noah definitely still had it. It didn't make sense that he wouldn't try to multiply his speed as he ran. Lionel had thought that it was related to the chains wrapped around their bodies. After all, Earth had had force blocking methods, so even though Lionel hadn't run into such a thing at higher dimensions, that didn't mean that they didn't exist. Maybe he had just been lucky to not stumble into such a thing. However, while Lionel had been destroying their bindings, other than the strength and power of the ores used to forge them, he didn't sense anything else about the chains. If they had been designed to block force, they would have resisted his Scarlet Star force a lot more and a lot better as well. Lionel's brows furrowed behind the mask of bright light that covered his face. He turned his attention toward the others and their reactions seemed to be similar. Even Miguel, who should have been close to if not the most talented among them, reacted in the same way. But he should have known. Miguel and Noah should be equally as talented, actually. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Noah surpassed Miguel in the future with the setbacks the latter has faced. But for them both to be in this situation, Lionel felt like a headache was coming along. He thought he had finally gained some help and support, but instead the people here were actually so weak. This was more than a little troublesome. He couldn't understand what was happening no matter how he racked his brain. This world was, indeed, stronger than the Void Palace grounds, but it wasn't exaggerated to the point that such geniuses couldn't even bring out at least a portion of their strength. Lionel needed more information. He had to enter the city. Lionel stood before he hesitated slightly. Leaving everyone here without his protection would make things a bit troublesome. They had been caught once already. What if they were caught again? Clearly, they didn't have the strength to protect themselves. No, that wasn't exactly true. Although they couldn't use force, their bodies were still quite powerful, and that was especially so for Miguel who had the Whitestone Elephant lineage factor. Lionel shook his head. He obviously couldn't bring them into the city with him. They wouldn't even be able to cross the bridge in their current state. Gritting his teeth, Lionel made a decision. You all will have to protect yourselves. Stick together. There is power in numbers. Head in. Lionel explained how to get to the village. Although he wasn't completely certain, he believed that the villagers would take them in. He hadn't spent much time there, but what he did know was that the village was in need of helping hands. If they had more hunters, their lives would be easier. Plus, Lionel would also have a method of finding them faster. After he was finished, he gave a small signal to Miguel and Noah, both of whom understood. They were grown men after all. Even if Lionel wanted to coddle them, they wouldn't allow it to happen. Their pride ran deep. They had been caught once, but they wouldn't allow it to happen again. Plus, they realized the gravity of the situation. Lionel was like a light at the end of the tunnel, but if there were really so few of them who could use their force, what chance did they stand of getting out alive? This might be a world, but it wasn't their world. And, even if they forced themselves to feel comfortable here, what of the human race? What would they do without them? Weren't they meant to be the protectors of the human domain? The frontline warriors? How could they not do everything in their power to return? And, even if they could forget their duty and stay here indefinitely, they were geniuses. They were used to wielding power and authority. How could they settle for being the bottom rung of society? Lionel turned and left, the group watching as his back disappeared with clenched fists. Noah rose to his feet, his emperor's might flickering in his eyes with a dense green. In the past, it had been able to blanket his surroundings in an oppressive pressure. But now, it was like a caged dragon, continuously ramming against its cage to no avail. Let's go, everyone. Lionel appeared by the edge of the abyss once again. The commotion had yet to die down, and there were several more overseers in the region. Some had surrounded their dead companion's body. Others were still discussing how to capture Lionel and his friends, while there was another group that Lionel was sure had likely already set off on a hunt. Still, despite this, Lionel acted as though nothing special was going on, strolling forward until he was eventually stopped. Halt! Lionel, who had spent hours observing the city, was already long since prepared. His hand flashed with bronze runes, and he smacked the hand of the overseer away. His actions were so abrupt and powerful that a resounding clap sounded through the atmosphere, followed by the crack of bone. Who the hell do you think you're touching? The overseer who had tried to stop Lionel had been reaching a hand for Lionel's chest and definitely hadn't expected such a thing to happen at all. However, he only paused for a moment before he grabbed his hand in agony, falling to the ground as he sucked in a cold breath. With the influx of overseers in the region, not all of them were as powerful as the one Lionel had killed. Realizing this, Lionel had purposely aimed for one he was certain he could handle, teaching him a swift and savage lesson. Without another word, he walked toward the chains and hopped on. Chapter 1509. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1509. Shameless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The overseers looked over to see their companion on the floor, but none of them moved to do anything. In fact, some of them shook their head and sneered. Rookies. As an overseer, you had a great deal of authority, but you required the strength to enact it first. If you targeted the wrong person, well, this would be your outcome. Lionel had observed enough to see the subtle sort of balance that was played out here. This world was far more unregulated than the ones he was used to. Just judging by the fact that people died here every day trying to cross the chain bridges spoke volumes. This place was one where power spoke above all else. In that way, it wasn't too unlike the Void Palace. But Lionel highly doubted there were rules against killing here. One might wonder, then, why it was that Lionel was chased like he was. That was even simpler. Where power ruled and money talked, there were obviously some people's bottom lines that shouldn't be touched. The fact slavery was allowed here meant that there was someone higher up that benefited from them. The overseers watched in silence as Lionel crossed the bridge. Since this young man they had never seen before dared to be so arrogant, he should have the strength to cross the bridge as well. Honestly, even they as overseers would choose to ride the snakes across unless it was an urgent matter. It wasn't that they didn't have the strength to cross. It was rather that no one would want to place their lives at risk for no reason. The rookie overseer, who was still seething on the ground, couldn't help but look toward Lionel's back with red eyes, hoping that he would fall over to his death. But he didn't dare to voice this out loud. The chains swayed beneath Lionel's feet, and his eyes narrowed. His control over his body was immaculate, but even he felt shaky in this place. There was definitely something deeper to these chains. Something that went beyond what the naked eye could see. Lionel tapped his foot and shot forward as though he was racing across a track. His actions left the overseers frozen. There were very few who dared to use that kind of speed on the chains. They were few and far between. However, something told Lionel that this kind of speed was the only way to ensure his survival. The odd rushes of wind, the rhythmic swaying of the chains, there was something oddly hypnotic about them. Lionel subconsciously wanted to find out more, but it was precisely because of this that he blazed for. He had a feeling that if he focused so much on it, he truly would fall. In just a few minutes, Lionel had made it to the other side. But the fact it took him so long at such a speed was enough to show just the kind of behemoth-like city he was dealing with. When Lionel entered the gates, he found a world of metal. The homes, the shops, the skyline, all of it was encased in some sort of silvery metal, some sections far more rusted than others. The combination made some of the city look like a futuristic utopia, and other parts look like the dilapidated ghettos of a dystopian hellscape. The push and pull somehow reminded him of the swinging chains to his back. Why did it feel like everything about this place was playing on his mind somehow? Lionel walked forward, trying to get a lay of the city. He had come here for information, but he didn't even know where he should be going, or even what he was looking for information about, truthfully. The answers he needed felt too broad. Understanding would require a comprehensive understanding of a world he had only just stepped foot into. Maybe there's an easier way? A library? An information center? What should I do about currency? It would feel suspicious if I just entered the city only to leave because I didn't have a place to sleep. After observing the city for a while, there seemed to be a lot of people who enter, but those that left were far fewer, and didn't seem to be the same individuals either. Lionel shook his head. I should have extorted that overseer for some cash. It didn't take long for Lionel to learn about the currency system. He just needed to casually observe some shops for a bit. The currency system this city used was coin-based. Oddly enough, though, these coins seemed to flicker with their own light as though there was a universe of stars hidden within them. Lionel was entirely certain he would have to personally inspect them to see what was so special. Luckily, there were many who entered the city like Lionel who were looking for jobs and money. It didn't take long before Lionel found a job center, with a long lineup outside. Unfortunately, while Lionel could speak the language, he couldn't read it, so it had taken him longer to find this place than he cared to admit. But after reading so many signs and posters, and cross-referencing with the services they gave, he was slowly building a database of their alphabet as well. What job would you like? An uninterested voice came from the counter. The middle-aged woman behind it had already sunk into the monotony of her life and job, so she wasn't very eager to show any enthusiasm. Lionel was a bit embarrassed because he could read the postings very well. So, instead of taking such a route, he decided to be a bit shameless. Good afternoon, gorgeous. How about you help me out a bit? I need a job that is easy and high-paying. Do you have one? Lionel leaned forward, whispering so that only the woman behind the rusted metal counter could hear him. The woman was quite used to such asks, so she looked up, still uninterested. Until that is, she met Lionel's eyes. Something about their pale violet drew her in. What beautiful eyes. Chapter 1510. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1510. Bunny, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel smiled as he strolled away from the counter, his mission successful. However, he soon cleared his throat and put on a semi-serious expression. He would have to take this to his grave. He definitely couldn't let Anna know he was selling himself like that. He couldn't appear to be so cheap, his body was sacred. Lionel looked down at the permit in his hands, oriented himself, and began to walk forward. Truthfully, he was a bit worried about what he had gotten himself into. A job that was both easy and high-paying didn't come so freely, as ironic as it might sound. And remembering that knowing, coy smile the middle-aged woman had given him, Lionel could only shake his head. But this was the best option he had. He could take a laborer's job, but if his head was stuck in a mine or an oil rig all day, How would he find the information he needed? No matter what world you were in, information was the resource of the strong and powerful. In that case, Lionel could only aim for the very top. When Lionel reached his destination and saw that it was actually a high-class restaurant, he grinned. It seemed he had hit the jackpot. Not wanting to cause trouble, Lionel wrapped around back. Nothing would be worse than ruining such a good thing. It only took a glance to see the kind of people they let into this place. If Lionel tried to enter with his current clothing, he would get chased out with a broom. After reaching the back stealthily, Lionel knocked on the door a few times and waited. About a half-minute later, the head of a man wearing what looked like a chef's cap poked out, a large cloud of steam following him. The man's face was so rosy that one would have thought that he was doing something very different from cooking. "Who are you?" The man's voice came out in a loud shout. It was either he was too used to his bustling work environment, or there was something wrong with his ears. Still, Lionel didn't say much and just handed over the permit. "A new brat? Good. And you're actually sensible enough to come around back instead of scaring away all my customers. Not bad. If you can survive a few hours, I might call you back tomorrow." Lionel's lip twitched. What was that supposed to mean? Wasn't this supposed to be an easy job? Come to think of it, there's actually a group of ladies that just came in. Good timing. Lionel found himself being pulled in by his collar, like some sort of rag doll. This man had more strength than it seemed. Why he would become a cook with this level of strength was beyond Lionel entirely. "Kara, get the new brat into an outfit and show him the ropes." When Kara rounded a corner, Lionel choked on his own spit. He didn't like where this was going one bit, not the slightest bit. This wasn't an easy job at all. In fact, if he wasn't careful, he would leave here only after losing a layer of skin. Kara was dressed like a bunny rabbit, her legs covered in fishnet stockings. Lionel was in an all-new world, but he was sure that this was a universal language all men could understand. She was tall, or maybe it was just the 6-inch high heels she wore. Either way, her legs were definitely long, slender, and toned. The black leotard she wore gripped tightly to her ground and around her waist, wrapping around her back to split what must have been 2 fleshly mounds into 4. It wasn't shy about tightening around her in the slightest, and that pattern continued with her chest as well. Kara was definitely a world-class beauty, but her outfit only made it all the more exaggerated. And like a finishing touch, her fake bunny ears actually moved along with her eyebrows as though they were real. Kara must have thought that Lionel was ogling her by this point, but the truth was that Lionel never really reacted to women outside of Aina, even if they were objectively just as beautiful. Though in this case Kara was actually a tick below. What Lionel was really reacting to was the realization of what he had gotten himself into. He wanted to shed tears, but it was already too late. That middle-aged woman had really taken nice care of him. "All right, come. My customers are waiting, I only have a few minutes." Kara pulled Lionel along toward the back of the kitchen and dragged him into the workers' change room and office. Without a care for Lionel's gaze, she turned her back to him and pulled down her leotard to her belly button, revealing a beautiful back view. Then she reached into her locker. With one hand, she pulled off a pair of nipple pasties, and with the other, she replaced them with a new, less sweaty pair, before pulling her leotard back up. She took no more than a few seconds to finish. Once she was done, she went to the only desk in the room and pulled open a drawer, taking out a new uniform. This is the uniform for the male workers. Most of them can't hack it, and those that can are usually chased away by the customers. Those women have pretty high standards, but judging by your looks, you should pass with flying colors. The only question is how entertaining you can be. Female customers are more difficult to please than male customers are, so you'll need to work harder. Think of a routine, or find something interesting to chat about. Remember the rules though. They're a bit different for male hosts. Touching can only be initiated by the customer. All forms of sex are not allowed within the walls of the restaurant. And above all else, the customer's pleasure comes first. Lionel caught the uniform Kara threw over and watched her sway out. He stood in silence for a long time, not knowing what to think. Fuck. Chapter 1511. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 15:11. Bonus. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 5,250 golden tickets. Next at 67.50. Fallen Apostle Volume 2 pre-order is live. Information in author's note below. Smiley face. Lionel sighed. All things considered, this sort of place really was the best to use to gather information. A gathering of noble and rich people, all a little too drunk to always act in their best judgment. This was the perfect place. Forgive me, Aina, this is for the greater good, I swear. Lionel stripped and began to put on his uniform. When he saw what it was, he sighed a breath of relief. At least it wasn't too outrageous. He had been expecting the worst, skin-tight Speedos, oil, and maybe a pair of bunny ears for himself, the works. Luckily, it wasn't that exaggerated. The pants were a pair of dress pants. Though they were a bit tight, it wasn't too bad. Lionel was just surprised that they actually had a set tall enough for him. The shoes matched the pants quite well. Lionel slipped them on, and then clipped on the suspenders to the pants. As for the shirt, I knew it was too good to be true. Lionel looked up toward the ceiling. There was no shirt. Lionel weakly put on the bow tie, his eyes threatening to flood with tears. Then without a choice he stepped outside. The steam of the kitchen assaulted him once again, only making matters worse. With this moisture clinging to him now, he might as well have lathered himself in oil too. Oh, who would have thought? You actually had quite the frame under there, huh? The chef, who Lionel had realized by now people called Chef Luca, laughed when he saw Lionel's appearance, nodding to himself. While he spoke, several of the female cooks couldn't help but look over as well. Twice, even. Lionel's metal body definitely did him several servers. Whether it was vascularity or muscle definition, he didn't lack any of it. Plus, he also wasn't overly large, and could even be considered to be quite slender. He truly did have a lethal attraction to a certain demographic, and it only made it better than his face was quite handsome as well. Just when Lionel was going to respond, another bunny lady poked her head in. Chef Luca, VIP 3 is still clamoring. You said the newbie would be ready soon? Chef Luca slapped Lionel on the back, nearly sending him sprawling forward. Yep, the kid's right here. Don't eat him up before he gets up there, he's for the customers. The new bunny girl's eyes lit up when she saw Lionel, eyeing him up and down. Her hand even had the audacity to reach for his crotch as though she wanted to check the goods, but was quickly caught by Lionel's hand. She giggled as though it wasn't a big deal. Feisty. If you let me touch, I would have given you a taste, too bad. Alright, come, they're waiting. Lionel could only speechlessly follow. He had been about to get angry at the bunny girl, but she moved on so quickly that he couldn't even ramp up a response. It was either she really didn't take it to heart, or she was also too good with certain kinds of social interactions. When Lionel stepped out of the kitchen, he was hit with a wall of sensory information. The first floor was quite bustling. Waiters dressed in skimpy clothing glided in and out of the kitchen, customers shouting out their orders or demands, and in the background, an odd music that seemed a cross between rock, jazz, and hip-hop played. There weren't very many women on the first floor at all. In fact, the only women were the waiters and all the customers seemed to be men. However, as Lionel traveled up the stairs, he could see more female customers, usually hidden behind doors. It seemed that even in this world, women were more secretive about this kind of stuff. Though, Lionel was a bit baffled that this was a co-ed sort of place. Usually such gentlemen and women's clubs were for one gender or the other. Harry's VIP room 3. Go get him, Tiger. Lionel was unceremoniously kicked into the room. He even felt that it was a bit of payback for snubbing her earlier. Something that was confirmed when he heard her voice from the other side. If you survive this, handsome, I just might forgive you. My name is Amory, by the way. Amory's giggles faded as Lionel turned his attention to the room before him, the sliding door closing to his back. Lionel had expected a similar sort of reaction to what he had received outside. He assumed that women who came here were quite eager and forward. Plus, Amory had even described them as clamoring. But when he actually saw the state of the room and its guests, he didn't even know what to say. There were 4 pairs of cold eyes staring back at him, each colder and more frigid than the last. Of course, Each of them was also paired with the face of a beauty. Or, maybe that was more surprising than expected. There were 5 total people, the 5th of them seeming to be the most amused of them all. Lionel didn't need anyone to tell him that this mischievous young woman had probably been the one to insist on his appearance. From what it seemed, the others didn't even welcome him here. And that just made the clothing he was wearing seem even more inappropriate. Lionel wasn't a person who got embarrassed easily, but that was more a product of the way he lived life. He did and acted as he pleased, following his own mind and heart, so of course there was nothing to be embarrassed about. But this, he hadn't planned or decided on any of this. To make matters worse, of the 5 women, only 2 were the young age of the mischievous woman. Of the other 3, one looked to be over 50 years old, while the other 2 seemed to be in their late 30s to 40s. Of course, this wasn't their real age, and they were likely much older. But as a person of Earth, Lionel had gotten used to judging people like this. At that moment, a flicker of killing intent flashed within the eyes of one of the 2 middle-aged women, and Lionel's heart skipped a beat. It seemed he had really gotten stuck in something ridiculous this time. Chapter 1512. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1512. Off guard if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. It didn't take a genius to understand what the problem was. Reputation was a woman's currency in worlds like this. Or more accurately, this sort of reputation in specific. The young woman might have thought that this was a funny joke to play on her elders, but clearly she hadn't thought of the fact that doing such a thing put Lionel in danger. These women were all of high status, and the pressure they gave Lionel was not small. They made the burly man and even Chef Luca look like jokes. Lionel had no doubt that if they wanted to kill him, or at least someone in the 5th dimension like himself, it would be a simple matter. These women had likely not even known what kind of establishment this was before they came, only deciding to dine here at the poking and prodding of the woman. And now Lionel was stuck in the middle of this mess. In their eyes, the easiest thing to do would just be to kill Lionel, and be done with it. As for the young woman, at worst she would get a light reprimand. The fact that she had dared to do this in the first place reeked of coddling. This young woman had definitely been doted on and spoiled all her life. But at the end of the day, Lionel wasn't a normal person. The hint of killing intent he had sensed was all it took to flush the embarrassment out of his system, his own gaze even flashing with its own coldness for a moment as he stood straight. However, as quickly as the coldness had appeared, catching the oldest woman of them off guard, it vanished. This older woman was the only one to have shown killing intent, but that didn't mean the others wouldn't have caught on quickly. It was just that this woman was the most experienced of them, and understood the magnitude of the situation very quickly. So much so that she was ready to act almost instantly. Clearly, given her strength, Lionel's own thinking speed might actually be inferior to hers. That said, that didn't mean that Lionel's reaction would be slow. Just when the coldness in his eyes vanished, he revealed a bright smile. Taking a step toward the table, he did something that left the women speechless. Lionel picked up a large pitcher of water, raised it high and poured it. This much would have been fine if his aim was a cup, but to the horror of the women, he poured the water toward the head of the mischievous young woman who had caused all of this to begin with. The young woman squealed, expecting a splash of water to drench her through. The other women were so caught off guard by the happenings that they, too, didn't know how to react. Was this young man crazy? Did they scare him so much that he lost his wits? Despite having the strength to dodge the water quite easily, as Lionel had deduced, this young woman had been coddled all her life. If even her seniors couldn't react to such a ridiculous situation, how could she? She ducked and covered her head with her hands. Her speed actually fast enough for Lionel to raise an internal eyebrow. Other than this, though, Lionel was quite calm. In fact, he was sighing a breath of relief. So long as they didn't act now, they wouldn't act later, at least not until much later, that is. Luckily, they hadn't thought of the possibility that he could be trying to start a wet t-shirt contest. If they did, then he really would be finished. But to these prim and proper older women, when would they have ever stumbled into such a thing? They would probably only realize the problem after the young woman was drenched. That said, Lionel never had any intention of actually doing that. Just when the water was about to hit the young woman's hand-covered head, Lionel's free hand rose and sparkled with a delicate bluish-black energy. Like that, the flowing water became a sled of ice. The ice cubes that had once been in the pitcher following the winding trail of Lionel's fingers. The ice cubes became like sleds flowing down a mountain of snow, curving and often nearly falling time and time again, as though they were in a real race. The ice track wound around Lionel and the young woman's bodies, filling the room with a refreshing cool air that it had lacked before. Then at the end of it all, the ice cubes fell from the end of the track, and it seemed as though Lionel had finally made a mistake. But to the astonished gazes of the women, one by one, the ice cubes neatly stacked themselves into a tall tower, wavering only slightly, but ultimately remaining steady. Wah! The young woman had long since risen her head, watching this scene with a hint of unconcealed delight in her eyes. She had never seen anyone with such masterful control of force before. At that moment, Lionel clapped his hands and the slide of ice shattered into twinkling crystals that he quickly caused to gather up above his hand. With a pitcher in one hand and a twinkling ball of ice in the other, Lionel brought them together once more. Just like that, there was a plop of water and the ice had once again become a pitcher of liquids, the frosty force having been pulled out entirely. Lionel flicked his wrist, allowing the frosty energy to shoot toward the ceiling as he used his now free hand to pick up another pitcher of water. Then he began to pour them both over the tower of ice cubes without even the slightest hesitation. Right then, the ball of frosty energy he had thrown into the air fell back down, colliding with the two streams of water and the ice cube until they all formed a giant cube of ice about the size of a head. Lionel placed the two pitchers of water down and revealed a charming smile. He tapped his foot on the ground, causing the table to quake and allowing a butter knife to fly up, spinning into his hand. Then the butter knife began to glow with a golden light that caught the older women off guard and left the young woman dazzled. Chapter 1513. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 20 seconds p.m. Chapter 1513. Which path? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The young woman might not understand the magnitude of what they were seeing, but how could these older women now? In order to control the ice slide like Lionel had, he not only had to be able to control force outside of himself. In this world, this was something so rare that they didn't know how to put it into words. Lionel was oblivious to this, only doing what he needed to do to survive. But he had already shocked the oldest women of them to such an extent that not only had her killing intent vanished, she looked toward Lionel with quite some interest. Of course, this interest had nothing to do with Lionel's looks. She was long past that age. And even if she wasn't, she was trained enough not to show it on her face. No, this interest was something entirely different. And it only grew further when the butter knife began to glow. The older woman sat up, perched toward the edge of her seat. And then Lionel's hands began to move. It felt like watching poetry in motion. Though it mostly lacks substance, Lionel didn't have the skill to add artistic conception into something so complex. But what he did have was his dream world projection. When it came to copying, Lionel was even better than a computer. A camera would be limited by its lens and the number of pixels it could capture. How could it compare to the human eye? And beyond that, how could the human eye possibly compare to internal sight? And even a step beyond that, how could internal sight compare to Lionel's starry spirit domain? In just a few elegant strokes, the cube had already become a head. In a few more, it gained delicate feminine features. And in just a few more, it was so obvious what the results would be that the young woman began clapping her hands excitedly, the pinkish hue of her irises dancing with life and vitality. Just a few minutes later, Lionel scooped up an empty plate and slid the head onto it, the gorgeous portrayal of a beautiful young lady being left behind. I hope you've enjoyed. I don't wish to intrude on your meal any longer, so I will be leaving now. Take this as a parting gift. Lionel bowed and stepped back, his hand already on the handle. He had no intention of pushing his luck any further. These women were far too dangerous. He was relieved that he had managed to get so far and thanked himself for his quick thinking. But considering his style of dress, Things could quickly get ambiguous if he stayed any longer. Plus, these women probably wanted him to leave sooner rather than later in order to avoid misunderstandings. He could be considered to have done his job. The young woman pouted, but she didn't say much. It seemed that she also knew that she had pushed this prank of hers a little too far this time. And since Lionel had already done his job and given her such a nice show, she might as well let him go. However, what Lionel didn't expect was for him to be stopped. "Hold on a moment, lad." The old woman had quite a soothing voice, though hints of age and hoarseness could be heard within. Just looking at her, it wasn't difficult to accept that she had once been an astounding beauty in her youth, and she retained much of that even now though she looked to be in her 50s. "Yes, ma'am?" Lionel asked politely. "Have a seat. This old woman would like to ask you some questions." Lionel coughed lightly. Had he heard correctly? Him? Have a seat? What was going on here, exactly? He didn't sense any killing intent, but quite frankly, he would prefer if he could just leave now. He wouldn't be able to relax around these people, and his senses were constantly primed. Still, without much of a choice, Lionel could only pull up a chair and sit, lamenting for the 100th time about his lack of a shirt. But by this point the old woman didn't seem to care. The others, though, also seemed to be curious about what was happening. "What is your name?" "Lionel Morales." "Oh, you have a last name?" Lionel inwardly swore. Did this world have such customs? In some cultures he had studied, a last name was mostly something the nobility had. Usually, the commoners would only have their first name and nothing else. In such a society, last names were either bestowed by royalty or passed down through the lineage. This was why, often, being stricken from a family record had such a heavy negative connotation. It was akin to stripping your name from you. Of course, Lionel had always had the Morales name, so he didn't care much for the Luxnick's name. But the picture was clear enough. Lionel's mind jumped into overdrive, trying to figure a way out of this situation. But he knew that this old woman's thinking speed might very well be beyond his own. So he could wait too long or his lie would seem obvious. Luckily, the old woman had likely already gauged his strength, and would give a small grace to him for his assumed weakness. It wasn't long before Lionel made a decision, and his gaze flashed with a cold light the old woman easily caught. From what he had observed in this world, there was a lot of butting heads and strife. He also felt that the secret to the abyss was deeper than he knew. In that case, yes. That was Lionel's response, simple and to the point. And yet, it seemed to be exactly what the old woman wanted to see and hear. She nodded in understanding, her gaze seeming to soften somewhat. However, this reaction only made her next words all the more hypocritical. "I see. Then what I'm asking of you now might be difficult for you to accept, but in your current situation, it's the only out I will allow you. Join my oligarch family or die. Which path do you choose?" Chapter 1514. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 1514. We leave if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression grew frigid, and this time, he didn't bother to conceal it. Before it had been an act. He wanted the old woman to believe that he was indeed from a family with a last name, but also imply that this family had been destroyed. Lionel had made a bet that in a world like this one, such a thing wasn't rare at all. In fact, he wouldn't be surprised if in every city like this one, there was a constant overturning of the big shots. Just from walking the streets, he had sensed the division of power and the tension. And just by the fact this old woman's first instinct was to kill him rather than shoo him away, spoke volumes. This old woman was a veteran of this world. She had definitely seen a lot. Just reading her disposition and inclinations told Lionel all he needed to know. So he assumed the identity of the final heir to a destroyed family. But that was exactly why this old woman's ask of him was so disrespectful. Her words were very precise. She asked him to join her family, and even named them for extra emphasis. She didn't ask him to work for her family, she didn't ask him to become a retainer or one of their guards. She asked him to join. She was asking the last member of a dead family to discard their duty, and their name to become her little pet project. Put as bluntly as possible, She wanted Lionel to discard the Morales name and become an oligarch. This was something far worse than a slap to the face. She might as well have dug up his ancestors' graves and given each one of them one too. Despite seeing Lionel's expression, the old woman seemed unhurried and unbothered, even taking a sip of the tea she had before her until she realized that Lionel's little performance had actually taken the heat off quite a bit. Unfortunately, this small victory wasn't enough to do much for Lionel. This world didn't mean much to him. It was just a zone he would be doing everything in his power to get out of. However, the character he was playing had no choice but to react like this. Well, if Lionel were to say that it was all an act, that would be an outright lie. His name was given to him by his father, the man he respected most. And even if he hadn't cared about his name that much, he didn't take too kindly to others disrespecting him. The young woman seemed stunned by the change in the situation, and even more stunned by Lionel's demeanor. She couldn't remember anyone ever daring to look at the old woman like that, ever. People were usually as quiet as mice around her, which was precisely why she thought that this prank would be so funny. Hey, don't look at my grandma like that. What's so wrong with joining my family? Lionel completely ignored the young woman. He had already forgiven her once for ignorance, but now he was getting annoyed. She looked to be in her 20s. He really couldn't understand how she had made it so far while being such an air-headed brat. Seeing Lionel ignore her, the young woman almost flared up again, but she was doused by a gaze from her grandmother. Mistress Olidark put her teacup down, her movements unhurried. She couldn't enjoy lukewarm tea, plus, she didn't really care about giving Lionel time to think. They had already been in this establishment for far too long, and they had indulged her granddaughter's prank enough as well. She calmly rose to her feet. You will come with us. If you perform well, you will receive more chances. I can see that you've yet to be promoted to the 6th star, likely because your records of how to do so were lost along with your family. If not for this, I doubt a talent of your caliber would still be in the 5th star after all this time. Do your duty and you'll earn a path even to the charmed path. If you exceed my expectations, I might even give you a chance to court and marry my granddaughter. Lionel furrowed his brow. 6th star? What the hell was that? The young woman blinked before she suddenly registered her grandmother's words. In that instant, she flushed completely red. Grandma. Mistress Olidark chuckled and walked over to ruffle her granddaughter's hair. We leave. Now. The other women stood quickly, following the old woman's lead. In the end, it seemed that there was no intention of giving Lionel a chance. The process of leaving the restaurant wasn't very difficult at all. Lionel was a new recruit to begin with, and Chef Luca seemed too scared even to raise his head too high. What Lionel didn't know, though, was that soon after they left, a squad dressed in deep blacks appeared, slaughtering everyone. Whether it was Chef Luca, Kara, or the mischievous Amory, all of them were now nothing more than corpses drowning in crimson alongside the customers they had been serving that day. Oblivious to this, Lionel could only make his way to the Olidark estate, a large land near the very center of the city. No, it could be said that it was the center of the city, the very beacon of the land itself. Lionel was, of course, finally given a shirt. And this shirt also happened to make his dress pants and shoes quite well, turning him from half a male stripper to a respectable young man in a single bound. The young woman, whose name Lionel knew to be Afri by now, seemed to become far more reserved now. However, Lionel wasn't in the mood to be bothered with her at all, because his situation only seemed to become worse. Upon entering the estate, he was ushered toward what they called their crafting hall, where he was unceremoniously tattooed with an odd mark on his shoulder blade. He grit his teeth as the energies that formed it drilled down through his skin and onto his bone and seemed to drain his force. Lionel's senses were far too sharp. After seeing the tattoo just once, he knew it was designed to track him. They really wanted to keep him in his place. Without even time to rest and recover, he was called to Mistress Olidark once more. It seemed that she already had something for him to do. Chapter 1515. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1515. Guarantees if audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Check out my new novel, Spirit Beast Enlightenment. 20 chapters out already. I don't plan on contracting it to WN either, so there's a potential to read to the end for free and another option to pay off-site for advanced chapters whenever you want. Lionel entered what he assumed was Mistress Olidark's office. However, despite seeing the older woman there, he didn't say a word, simply standing silently. He met her gaze and he even seemed to be quite relaxed. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a dull indifference, but his mind was constantly working at faster and faster speeds. He took in everything, sorted them, and then filed them away for a later date. Mistress Olidark seemed to realize that Lionel had no intention of respectfully greeting her like most would, but the result only made her chuckle. The more stubborn you are, the more difficult this will be for you. It's really that simple. A smart boy like you should be able to understand this. Lionel didn't respond at all, his eyes meeting Mistress Olidark's without a word. He wasn't a fool. In fact, if he fell in line so easily, rather than appreciating it, Mistress Olidark would keep him even further away. Someone that couldn't control their own emotions was far less of a threat than someone who could change their face on a dime. Any talent of Lionel's caliber would have their own pride. If he could so easily ignore it the moment a juicy piece of meat was dangled before his face, then he wouldn't be worth much to begin with. Mistress Olidark wanted him to both abandon his family name, and to add insult to injury, she even said that the ultimate reward would be marrying her daughter. Setting aside the fact that Lionel had Aina, and that brain-dead girl would drive him to an early death, what kind of man would want to marry into his wife's family? To become a live-in son-in-law? And that was supposed to be the ultimate reward? Plus, even if Lionel was so shallow as to go after Athri for nothing more than her beauty, could she even compare to Aina? She was still several points below his girlfriend, so Mistress Olidark was far too arrogant to believe that her granddaughter was really so enticing. At that moment, Mistress Olidark pulled out a document that seemed to be made of thick hide and unfurled it. On it, there were many words, a lot of which Lionel had already begun to understand now. He had about a 40% grasp of reading this language. He would probably need an extra 2 or 3 days to grasp it fully. That time frame could be made faster if he gained access to a library or a dense amount of text. But he somehow doubted that he would get such an opportunity anytime soon. Sign it. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Signing something he couldn't fully understand? Absolutely not. There didn't seem to be any binding force arts on it, but Lionel still knew too little about this world to make a perfect judgment just yet. He felt that he was sensitive enough to pick up on such things, but he also had no idea what sort of abilities someone as powerful as this old woman might have. Plus, he didn't know what her ability index was either, and the abilities of this world seemed far different from the ones he had gotten used to, so he was currently in no man's land. For all he knew, she could bind him for life with this signature. However, after thinking to this point, Lionel calmed. If that was what this signature was for, then what would have been the point of the tattoo on his back? It made little sense to do both if one was so binding. Secondly, this might be an opportunity. Lionel remained unmoving. He didn't even glance at the outstretched pen. As time passed in silence, Mistress Olidark's light smile became colder and colder. This Lionel was truly testing her patience. It seems that if I don't teach you a lesson, you'll believe that you're truly unbendable, The pen flew forward with a flick of Mistress Olidark's fingers, a pressure exuding from it that made it impossible for Lionel to move. However, even with this being the case, Lionel never had the intention of moving in the first place. He stared at the flying pen. The moment it entered the current 6-inch range of his starry spirit domain, he had already pinpointed exactly where it would land and exactly how much damage it could do. Without even hesitating, he used dream sense, cutting off the nerves in the area from sending any signals to his mind. The pen seemed to be aimed right for his throat, but it veered away at the last moment, piercing right through his collarbone and splitting the bone in two. Mistress Olidark had expected Lionel to show a hint of when the pen aimed for his throat, and then fall in pain once his bone broke. However, he didn't even flinch. His gaze never left her eyes, staring her down as though he wanted to see if she would actually dare. The pen snapped back, ripping out of Lionel's collarbone, and back into Mistress Olidark's hand. Blood dripped from the end, a pitter-patter sound echoing through the room as it fell onto the parchment paper. If you want me to sign anything, Lionel started coldly, then there had better be guarantees. I'm not going to sign away my name and my dignity, just so that you can string me along for a few decades until I've run out of use to you. If that's your plan, you might as well try and kill me now. Try? Mistress Olidark's cold smile turned into a deeper sneer. Do you think you can even breathe if I don't allow you to? The files in the room rustled, a pressure the likes of which caused the room to shake. The force threatened to bring Lionel to his knees, but his gaze only continued to flicker with a hidden violet. Yes, you can try. Lionel's voice didn't waver, his coldness matching Mistress Olidark beat for beat. Chapter 1516. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1516. Light and dark branch. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Check out my new novel, Spirit Beast Enlightenment. 20 chapters out already. I don't plan on contracting it to WN either, so there's a potential to read to the end for free and another option to pay offsite for advanced chapters whenever you want. Sometime later, Mistress Olidark sat in her room alone, calmly stacking papers. At that moment, a seemingly insignificant shadow in the corner moved and morphed into a person. Is it done? Mistress Olidark asked. You shouldn't have allowed his leash to be so long. You will regret it, the figure cloaked in black spoke. Too long? Maybe it isn't long enough. He isn't useful to me as he is now. He won't even defeat even the weakest of all the live-in son-in-laws I've collected, let alone becoming the strongest of them. If I don't allow him some free rein, I might as well just kill him now like he said. Then let me kill him. You've given him too much. His benefits are even better than an elder's. Free access to all of our techniques and cultivation methods was a bridge much too far. Mistress Olidark chuckled. If you were in the 5th star right now and I stripped you of all the knowledge you had ever learned past that point, and then I gave you access to all the knowledge I have now, how long would it take you to be able to threaten me? The figure fell into silence. My level isn't one you can reach even if you have all the resources in the world. At least not with 100% certainty. At best, you would have a slightly better chance than most. And even if the certainty was 100%, how long would it take you? 5 decades? A century? Even for my husband, it took at least this long, let alone for a brat who's already past his prime age for reaching the 6th star. Then you want him to be your spearhead? I want those who've forgotten the name Olidark only because my husband and my son-in-law have been gone for a decade to remember it. Aside from Sebastian and Slayton, the others I've brought into the family are far too lacking, and even those 2 aren't good enough. This family needs a man. You believe that he is a better option than those 2? The figure seemed somewhat surprised. It was rare for a person like them to show any sort of emotion at all. So just this little bit might as well have been the equivalent of an avalanche to anyone else. Maybe I'm still unsure. If what he's shown is all he has, then no. But if the answer is no, then giving him such a long leash is even less of a worry. But if I'm correct, and the answer is instead yes, then it's because he has something much deeper within him that I'm quite interested in. If this is your plan, then I assume you plan to use the ancestors' altar when the time comes. Are you sure you want to subject Athri to a life of marriage with a puppet? Mistress Olidark shook her head. That little girl has grown up too spoiled because she has no real talent of her own. Her only use is the Olidark blood that runs through her veins. With a talented husband, she might be able to produce an heir worthy of our family name. To do so is her duty. This life that she gets to live is built off the backs of the talents of the previous generations. She will also have to sacrifice something if she wants to be so carefree. The figure nodded. In fact, it didn't seem to actually care about Athri at all. It just wanted to hear exactly this response. The Olidark family was split into the light branch and the dark branch. The light branch was currently headed by Mistress Olidark while the dark branch was headed by the figure. They were both of the same family that had split many generations ago. In order to survive for as long as they had, A family needed a group of individuals with just as much vested interest in their success, who also happened to be willing to do the dirty work, and that was where the dark branch came into play. The truth was that the only ones who even knew of the existence of the dark branch were very select members of the light branch. This secret was one that was passed down in silence from generation to generation. Before, the figure had questions about whether their mistress would be strong-hearted enough to do what needed to be done. If the answer was no, then as they had done before, the dark branch would have to remove her and allow a branch family to come into their own. But the figure was very satisfied with the mistress' response. This was the character an oligarch should have. It was fine if the light branch had weakened somewhat. It couldn't be helped. The summons of those people could not be ignored, and it wasn't yet confirmed whether or not the former patriarch and their family son-in-law had died yet. There was still a good chance they hadn't. Physical weakness was allowed. However, a weakness of the heart should be rooted out as quickly as possible. In fact, it was also because of this that the figure didn't oppose the long leash Lionel was given either. To be dauntless in front of death was exactly the kind of character an oligarch's son-in-law should have. That said, I haven't let him off too easily. Mistress Oligarch finished arranging her papers and stood. If he wants to take advantage of that long leash of his, he'll have to earn it. I've used a squad to keep an eye on him to make sure he doesn't get any funny ideas, but I'm sure he's smart enough to know that since I've released him so easily, I can reel him back in whenever I want. As Mistress Oligarch had said, Lionel was already sent out of the estate on a mission, and he could obviously guess that he would be monitored if he was being let go so easily. What wasn't easy was what he was tasked to do. He stood at the edge of a deep abyss, shaking his head. His collarbone had yet to heal, but he was being sent on a death mission. How fun. Chapter 15-17. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 15-17. Abyss. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a seat at the edge as though he couldn't sense anything around him. As expected, the abyss had wrapped all the way around the city. As for why, Lionel felt that he had a small understanding now after listening to Mistress Oligarch. This city was placed here to protect what Lionel assumed was the world at large. As for what it was protecting the world from, it was down there, in the abyss. Lionel assumed that all of the cities were probably like this, protecting some sort of abyss from something. This sort of environment would also explain why everyone was always so high-strung and focused on power. They were, quite literally, on a battlefield. Mistress Oligarch's exact words just a few minutes ago were, "My Trith City has been protected by my Oligarch family for centuries. If you want guarantees, fine, I'll give them to you. But, you won't receive them for nothing. Since you want to make this an equal exchange, we can do so. Everything you do will be done based on merits. You will be constantly monitored and your performance will dictate how much you receive. However, if you want to unlock these options, you'll have to bring me back the head of a 6-star demon. If you can't do that, you're not worth investing in." From these words, Lionel had made his deductions, and now he was sitting at the edge of the abyss. There were several people around him giving him odd looks, but they didn't say anything more, and went about their business. This section of the city not only had chains running across, but they also had chains dangling down. Clearly, these chains were meant to be used to descend to whatever world was below. Lionel watched a group climb back up, beaten and haggard. One of them had lost an arm, and yet he was helping another who had lost a leg to walk. Yet, they were all grinning ear to ear, carrying bags of a bloody something. It was clear that whatever they had killed down there made the journey worth it for them. However, there were quite a number of teams that didn't have expressions that were nearly as happy. It was either they had lost someone precious to them, or their harvest wasn't as great. Just by observing this alone, Lionel was sure that there were huge numbers of groups that never returned at all. It was cruel. Lionel had thought that the Void Palace was already a cruel enough place, but at least that establishment was a gathering of geniuses, the best humanity had to offer. But from what it seemed here, no one had such a chance. The entire world was the front line when the enemies were right beneath your feet. It was a sobering thought. and it almost helped Lionel to understand Mistress Olidark's forcefulness. With such pressure constantly weighing down on you, how could you always worry about doing what was morally upright? Lionel himself had been grappling with this problem ever since he stepped foot into the dimensional verse. And yet his problems weren't nearly as severe as this. Or so it seemed. Lionel touched his collarbone. It was still very tender. His passive healing factor had done quite some work, but it wasn't enough. Of course he could use, but he didn't want the Olidark family to know he had a trump card. If he could help it, he would only use what he had already shown them, his water force affinity and his spear force. He knew that he was likely being followed or monitored. He just didn't know how. So he had to be cautious. Plus, he was about to enter a battlefield. Who knew if he would need to use within the next 24 hours? It would be foolish to waste it now. With his touch, Lionel winced a bit, but eventually shook his head. Freezing his collarbone now would actually make him heal more slowly. So, since he was about 20% healed, he might as well go now. Luckily, his collarbone was cracked to one side, so it was still manageable to use one arm even though it stung a bit. After making his decision, Lionel hopped down, his feet gliding along the chains. With every tap he would slow down tremendously. But the light around him only seemed to dim faster and faster. It was at a rate that didn't make very much sense, but the dark force in the surroundings only multiplied. That odd feeling Lionel had experienced before came back, trying to lull his mind into an odd trance-like state. But in return he only went faster and faster, focusing his mind more. Lionel had no idea how long he had fallen for. He was so focused on not losing his mind that his sense of time distorted. There was an odd coercive force in this place that was placing pressure even on his mind. Toward this, his frown could only deepen. Is this anarchic force? Why does it feel so much more powerful? Lionel exhaled a breath, his brow furrowing. The anarchic force he knew could eat away at his force, but it mostly left his mind alone. This force seemed to be able to do both, attacking his body and mind simultaneously. Just when Lionel was wondering if he should climb back up to regroup, the stars in his ethereal glabella rotated, cleansing away the force that attacked his mind and catching Lionel off guard. It had such an ability? Lionel was a bit stunned. If this was really anarchic force, nothing should be able to just wipe it away like that. What was happening? Lionel's feet suddenly hit solid ground. Caught off guard, his knees bent somewhat awkwardly, but he managed to catch himself. Lionel frowned. Looking around, it felt like everything was dark. His eyes could hardly see anything. He couldn't even see the chain that had been by the side of his own as he descended. After walking forward, Lionel's expression changed. The chain actually wasn't there at all. It was like the two chains had transported people to completely different regions despite being right next to one another. Just when Lionel was going to mark the location of his own chain so he didn't lose track of it, the growl of a beast licked at his shoulder and neck. Chapter 1518. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 1518. Demon World. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression went cold, his body flickering. Even without relying on his ethereal star force, the speed he could tap into with his body alone was far beyond what most could match. A spike of pain came from his collarbone, but with his dream sense he would never allow it to impact his movement. At that moment, a sharp wind whistled by his neck and shoulder. The danger made Lionel's hair stand on end, but he still didn't see the result. However, just because he couldn't see it, doesn't mean he couldn't hear it. A whip-like mark cut across the ground. The grating sound of stone splitting entering Lionel's ears. Lionel tapped his foot on the ground, his speed accelerating once more as his palm flipped over to reveal his chain domain spear. In that moment, an absolute domain formed around him. His spear force acted like it had a mind of its own, springing to light like a flashbang of gold. A cycle of spear force spiraled to life, rotating with a vicious momentum ready to shred everything in its path to pieces. At the same instant, Lionel secretly tapped into his wisdom spirit branch, allowing his eyes to be replaced by that of the starry-tailed fox. His pupils dilated, a slightly brighter sheen taking hold of his irises. Though it was weaker than when he allowed himself to fully enter his fox form, it was far sharper than his normal vision. What he saw, though, made his eyes narrow once more. His spear force formed a wall of rotating golden energies. Beyond it, a grotesque humanoid beast-like creature fought against it, its flesh somehow strong enough to withstand it. It looked like a werewolf, but not. It stood on digitigrade hind legs, but its hands, or rather paws, had sharp claws that were each like scythes. Not a single one of them was shorter than 2 to 3 feet. It had a long snout like a wolf, but it also had a mane like a lion. Well, if a lion replaced all its hair with a dense black fire instead, that is. Its crimson gaze stared at Lionel through the rotating cyclone of spear force, its scythe-like claws trying to rip a path through. Lionel's expression turned cold. Piss off. Forceful. Lionel's spear pierced forward, his blade unceremoniously tearing a hole through the werewolf's fire mane, and leaving its neck in pieces. The werewolf demon beast's crimson eyes widened, before it fell to the side. It didn't think that Lionel would actually be so powerful. However, what made Lionel's heart grow cold was the fact he didn't see any fear of death in the creature's eyes. There was only surprise at Lionel's strength and nothing more. It was as though it never really cared about its life in the first place. The shadows watching Lionel's progress also paused in surprise. Even for someone in the 6-star, taking out a 5-star demon in a single strike was not a simple feat. Demons were far more exaggerated creatures than beasts. They tended to be much more powerful than their base realms would dictate. Lionel's head snapped in their direction, his cold gaze squinting somewhat. The shadows didn't move an inch. They had slipped up once, but they were extremely professional. It was just that Lionel's feat was far too surprising. This was definitely something they would have to report later. In their estimation, so long as they didn't move, Lionel would eventually believe that he had made a mistake and turn away. And sure enough, Lionel turned away again after frowning slightly. Still, they couldn't help but be inwardly shocked again. Such a small slip-up wasn't something that a 5-star should have been able to see through either. What they missed, though, was Lionel's sneer after he turned away. He had been making it a point not to show too much of his strength. But this was still within the realms of acceptability. He would be fine so long as he only continued to lean on his water force and spear force. However, he had purposely made that strike as dazzling as possible for 2 reasons. First, he wanted to learn of the standards of this world. And he also wanted to expose those following him. Now that he knew where they were, they could forget about continuing to hide from him. So long as he knew exactly where they were, he would be able to protect his life better without being too restricted. He could take advantage of their perspective to hide more of his strength, while simultaneously not being worried about displaying a bit more of it. Lionel shot forward. In such a dark area, he had definitely released far too bright of a light. He was practically yelling and screaming to every threat that he was right here. He made sure to note where the chain was. While he trusted his sense of direction, the fact the adjacent chain had disappeared told him that there was more to this world than he thought. Surprisingly, though, the darkness didn't remain for long. Lionel went from being shrouded in a perpetual black to entering a work of red-black a moment later. Up ahead, there was a land of mountains and hills. The earth was a dark red and the skies were a black-violet. The clouds had a weird bluish hue to them that made it feel like the fog of a hallucinogenic drug. Lionel's head snapped back, and he found a curtain of blackness. The abrupt change was jarring and didn't make much sense, but Lionel deduced that this was likely something that kept the city and the above world protected. He was correct. Only humans and demons beneath the 6th star could pass through this seemingly flimsy curtain of black. But this also meant that Lionel was in the true world of demons now. Lionel's steps pushed forward, entering a forest of dead and black trees, looking for his target. However, his goal was deeper than just this. Chapter 1519. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1519. 6-star demon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Happy New Year everyone. Hope your 2023 is a million times better than your 2022. I will be taking a 1-day break tomorrow, and will be back the following day with more chapters. Lionel stepped over another corpse, his gaze incomparably focused. There was a large population of 5-star demons in this region. He seemed to run into another one every few dozen meters. Every time he took one down, he tried to see if there was anything special about them, or maybe something that connected them, but the answer seemed to be no. What he didn't know was that the shadows that were following him all had weird expressions. They had never seen someone so casually ignore demon corpses like that. Did he not know the value of them? Or did he really not care? 5-star demon corpses were very useful even into the 6-star. Only 7-star individuals wouldn't bother to give them a second glance. Well, either that, or the true geniuses of the 6-star. Of course, they had no idea that Lionel truly didn't know. Lionel knew that he was being watched, so he was trying to find a method of stealthily finding out what he needed. If he couldn't, that much would be fine too. After he gained access to the Olidark family's library, he would find out one way or another. It wasn't that difficult for him to kill these demons to begin with. It was at times like this that the range of his starry spirit domain being so short was truly a problem. If he just had a meter or two, then he could envelop the demon corpse entirely. Then he could enter it perfectly into his dream simulation, then use a dream clone to check several methods of making use of these corpses. So long as the process wasn't too involved or require anything too complicated, it would only take him a few seconds to figure out why these demons were so valuable. Unfortunately, he couldn't do this, and there wasn't anything that seemed to tie these demons together. They all were of varying sizes and strengths. They used different methods to attack. They didn't even look the same. After the first werewolf demon, they ran into a spider demon, a snake demon, and he had even run into a weird-looking whale demon that quite legitimately looked like a whale with 2 powerful legs. How could he find any patterns like this? Lionel's steps paused, his heartbeat becoming more solid and sustained. Up ahead, there were 2 demons. No, more accurately, there was one demon and the other was nothing more than a ravaged corpse. Lionel had never laid his eyes on something so eerie in his life. It was a beautiful creature. Or rather, it should have been. It was a unicorn with a beautiful white mane and silver hooves. From the back, it looked like it had come right out of a fairy tale. However, when Lionel got closer, he noticed that it was nothing short of a nightmare. Its neck and part of its torso was split in 2. Grotesque vines wiggled out from the oval-shaped bloody hole, dripping with a sticky, viscous, and clear liquid. The mouth of the unicorn demon was filled with 3 rows of sharp teeth. Every time it bent down, it ripped out another chunk of the demon beneath it, chewing with a sickening look of satisfaction in its eyes. It seemed that Lionel had found his first 6-star demon. The shadows watched this scene with their own gazes focused. Would he run? That was their first thought. Lionel didn't understand anything about demons, but they knew beautiful demons like this were among the most dangerous. The less demon-like they were, the more powerful they were. As for why this was, no one was entirely sure. Or, at least those of their level had no idea. Even if this was just a Tier 1 6-star demon, it was more dangerous than even most mid-level demons. In their opinion, Lionel's luck was terrible. Even if he chose to run, it was probably already too late. Even though the demon didn't seem to have noticed Lionel yet, it had likely already sensed him long ago. However, much to their shock, clang, clang, clang. Lionel didn't bother to even try and hide his presence, a dense frosty aura radiating from him. With every step he took, another patch of ice appeared on the ground. It looked like he was paving a road of glowing blue, a color that made his pale violet hair and eyes look all the more pleasing to the eye. You're pretty powerful, huh? Lionel spoke to seemingly no one but himself, his smile cold. It wasn't a guarantee that the demon could even understand what he was saying as it finally looked up from its meal, curious about why this small human wasn't running. How about you play with me a bit then? Lionel stretched out his spear with a hand, the point beginning to glow with a furious golden light. The unicorn demon bared its teeth, all 3 rows glistening with blood, saliva and chunks of flesh. Lionel didn't seem to care about its answer. With another step he vanished. But the reaction of the unicorn demon wasn't slow in the slightest, the tentacles wiggling and the gaping hole shooting forward to intercept him. Clang! 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 Lionel's spear pierced outward with an unconscious speed, leaving after images in the air. It almost looked like he too had dozens of tentacles attacking at once. To his astonishment, the tentacles of the unicorn were both flexible and as sturdy as blades. Every collision felt heavy and nothing like flesh at all. Lionel's gaze flashed. Swift. Clang. 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 A curtain of gold seemed to cascade from Lionel, his speed reaching the point that the unicorn demon suddenly found all of its tentacles slapped into various directions. Before it could react, Lionel had appeared before it, his spear aiming right for its brows. At that moment, the unicorn demon released a low growl, its singular horn and its silver hooves beginning to glow a beautiful bright crystalline color. Its head lowered, its horn intercepting Lionel's blade. Bang! A strong force ripped Lionel from his feet, sending him flying backward like a speed bullet. At the same time, the wave of tentacles recovered, chasing after him with an aura of bloodlust multiplying around them. Chapter 1520. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1520. Composition. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel felt his arm threaten to fracture. As he flew back through the air, his eyes couldn't help but narrow. What a powerful creature. That was the first time Lionel's swift spear had actually been repelled. In fact, Lionel felt that if he had used forceful instead, he would have fractured his own arm on impact. Without his bronze runes activated, his body lost quite a bit of its durability. However, Lionel didn't seem panicked in the slightest. His feet hit the ground, his cold and indifferent gaze locking onto the surging tentacles. It seemed that this unicorn demon was getting quite confident. It even wanted to end this battle early, so that it could return to its meal. It probably even had thought of adding Lionel to that count. Lionel's lips curled into a sneer. He didn't like feeling like things weren't fully in his control. And if there was anything the last few days had been, it was out of his control. His mood wasn't the best right now. He was being followed by scuttling rats. The fate of his mother and his girlfriend were unknown. And now, he had no idea when he would be able to pull himself out from beneath the thumb of Mistress Olidark. This unicorn demon had picked the wrong time to come across. He no longer cared about the tender feeling in his collarbone. Lionel didn't move an inch, watching as though tentacles continued to fly toward him. But just as they entered a 5-meter range, his absolute domain activated once again, but this time, it was like a raging tornado of golden flames, shredding everything in its path apart. Fury. Applying concepts of fury to his spear force made it break apart like a volatile flame, even taking on slight characteristics of Lionel's Scarlet Star Force. There was no one in this world who could possibly understand the core meaning of fire better than Lionel could. He embraced it all, taking a step forward and disgusting globules of violet and black flesh and blood fell around him. Lionel brandished his spear, just the slightest violet glow appearing. His hair whipped about in the surging energy, his pale violet eyes and hair jumping to life, slumbering in silence, erupting at will. It was a simple string of 6 words, their meaning deep and unfathomable. In speaking them, Lionel's voice seemed to layer as though 2 entities were speaking at once, his cadence falling by several octaves with each syllable he spoke. If one thought that Lionel took 10 months to learn just 3 words, they would be sorely mistaken. Lionel hadn't been satisfied to rest until he had fully comprehended the strength of calligraphy and poetry. Now fueled by his projected artistic conception, the substance of his words held the weight of the world, unbridled and unfettered, unbothered and unhurried, untouchable and unquenchable. The strike seemed to tear the world in two, even the high dark clouds above stirring. The earth quaked and the black trees in the surroundings were ripped from the ground, their roots taking with them large swaths of earth as they were blown away. Lionel's spear quivered in excitement. As though a roaring flood dragon ready to break out of its cocoon, its tip vibrated with its own, and its body radiated a shimmering dark light. In one moment, Lionel was dozens of meters from the unicorn demon. In the next he appeared to its back, his hair slowly fluttering down from its raised state. The furious light in his eyes persisted for a while longer, the elegant line he had drawn across the air still shaking the hearts of all those who had seen it. It was fear. That single strike elicited a fear that they hadn't felt in a long while. A fear that they thought they had weeded out the moment they had stepped into the position in the dark branch. However, this child's strike had brought it back. At that moment, they realized that they had never gotten fear of that part of themselves. They had just managed to bury it deep. Right then, the neck of the unicorn demon imploded, its head flying into the air, and its body collapsing to the ground. Like this, a powerful demon collapsed to the ground, felled in a single strike. Lionel looked back. He didn't seem surprised by the result. His spear force was far stronger after a year than most knew. Maybe only he himself was aware of just how far he had gone. By this point, he could compose at will and execute it on a whim. So long as the word was in his base of prepared vocabulary, he could use it as pleased and then break it down and reconstruct it into a new phrase, sentence, or composition. To others, it would look as though Lionel had access to an endless supply of spear techniques, each more vibrant and powerful than the last, and most definitely more difficult to handle. The subtle conception was beyond what most could handle on a whim. At this point, Lionel didn't even feel any desire to learn any spear or bow techniques. He could make his own, forming them and stacking them into powerful combinations of words his enemies could only hope to match. Lionel put his spear away, picking up the unicorn demon's head up by its silver horn. However, at the moment he touched it, his expression flickered. This feeling, it was like he was touching an ore. With his Earth variant affinity, he was very certain of this. He couldn't possibly be mistaken. It was quite interesting. This meant that the bones of this unicorn demon could form metals of its own, something similar to the Morales family's lineage factor, metal synergy. Lionel didn't recognize this metal, so it was probably a composite of several the unicorn demon had absorbed. Since this was a zone, the metals should be the very same as what he had already long since memorized, so he was at least 90% sure of this. It would be 100%. But this zone was simply too odd. At that moment, another oddity occurred. Lionel felt his metal synergy lineage factor stir. Chapter 1521. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1521. A moment. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's brows jumped. He had experienced this feeling before. It happened when his snowy star owl lineage factor of the past entered the vicinity of the bronze tablet. Of course, the bronze tablet was stuck wherever the segmented cube's inner space was, along with the silver tablet, so they couldn't have caused this. Plus, this was obviously the head of a demon and not a tablet. So why would his lineage factor stir? From Lionel's limited understanding, this stirring represented a potential for evolution. Could it be that the Morales family signature lineage factor also had room to evolve? Lionel shook his head, unable to confirm this. He didn't know how a demon head would help with such a thing. It might be related to the value of these demon corpses, but he was unsure. Lionel didn't want to rashly do anything, not without first understanding the situation. His snowy star owl lineage factor had an obvious progression path, but if it really was the case that this demon head carried such a secret, it wasn't something that Lionel would casually do. His metal body was one of his greatest assets. What if this mutation or evolution hindered him from using it? What about his divine armor, another hugely important part of his battle prowess? Plus, his metal synergy lineage factor had technically already mutated once before. Not only was there a subtle connection between it and his King's Might lineage factor, but there was also the red energy it gave off to consider as well. From what Lionel understood, this mutation was likely caused due to the fact he had almost failed his first awakening phase. This was mostly his fault, since he had attempted to do it before he had even formed all of his nodes, something that was ridiculous. This was to say that he had already deviated once, and was lucky enough that things still stayed relatively on track. If he allowed it to mutate again, it was impossible to say if he'd get lucky again. Even if the result was a more powerful lineage factor, its overall effectiveness might be far inferior due to a lack of compatible techniques. This was a problem that Lionel was currently facing actually. He hadn't had the time to analyze the bronze tablet, so he hadn't been able to unearth the pairing techniques for his starry-tailed fox lineage factor. The good news was that this lineage factor was so far and beyond the snowy star owl that it was still worth it. But there was no telling whether it would be the same with his metal synergy lineage factor. Lionel finished his thoughts in just a few seconds. With one hand, he hoisted the unicorn demon's corpse over his shoulder, letting its hooves drag along the ground. Several eyes couldn't help but be drawn to Lionel. He hopped to the top of the abyss, his feet gliding up the side as though it was solid ground. Now that he could confidently rely on his stars to repel the anarchic force, he was no longer worried about the attack on his mind, and didn't take the chains seriously any longer. However, just because he didn't mean others also wouldn't. The contrast between Lionel and the others was far too great. When they saw that he had actually slayed a unicorn demon, many forgot to breathe, the suffocating aura of even the dead creature being too much for them to handle. The aura shrouded Lionel as well, making many miss the fact that he was actually in the 5th star. If they were able to focus enough to see through this, it was unknown just how much larger the uproar was. They all had their ingrained biases. Most people knew that the 6th star was the minimum requirement you should meet to even dare to venture into the demon world. No one even considered the fact that Lionel wouldn't ignore this rule. In fact, many believed that he might even be a legendary 7 star. Lionel didn't care about the stairs, his steps steady as he walked right through the city and toward the Olidark family's estate. No one even dared to stop him despite the fact that this was proper protocol. The gates of the Olidark family estate were always open. Why close them when no one would dare to casually stroll in to begin with? Maybe that was why Lionel's appearance was all the more shocking on that day. Several of the guards, servants and members of the family were stunned into silence. With how large the compound was, Lionel had to follow a long path with grassy pastures, noble statues and several ponds and fountains to his left and right. Yet he didn't seem to care about the beauty of it at all, as the ghastly blood of the demon over his shoulder continued to drip. At that moment, Afri walked out of the large doors of the main house with a wide smile on her face. To her side, a young man wearing a smile also walked. He was quite handsome, his black hair tinged with what seemed like a hint of blue much darker than the radiant blue of his irises. He had a subtle cadence to his footsteps that made it quite clear that he was an expert in his own right, or in anyone's right for that matter. When Afri looked up to see Lionel and the demon on his back, she released a high-pitched screech, immediately jumping to hide behind the young man. She grabbed at his arm, quivering and not daring to look forward again. She had never seen such a sight in her life and had been sheltered since her birth. How could she stand the sight of such a ghastly corpse? Lionel, though, who never had a favorable impression of this young woman to begin with, simply dropped the corpse and head and the foot of the stairs, climbing up and passing by the young man and Afri without a word. He didn't even seem to notice their presence. Just as he was about to walk in, though, the young man suddenly called out. "A moment, if you please," he said lightly. Chapter 1522. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1522. LC. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The young man sounded polite enough, so Lionel turned back. Although he didn't have a great relationship with the Olidark family, that didn't mean that he had to be hostile to everyone in it. Anya's words still seemed to play at the back of his mind from time to time. The young man smiled when he got Lionel's attention. "This is a bit inappropriate, don't you think?" He continued, his head pointing toward the demon corpse. It was indeed inappropriate no matter how you looked at it. To leave a corpse in front of the Olidark's family estate. Were you trying to wish ill upon the family? In fact, it wasn't even at the front of the estate, but the door to the main home. It was even more exaggerated. I think it would be more appropriate for you to clean this up. I can also see that you've caused quite a mess on your way here. The workers have their hands full every day as this is quite a large estate to care for. We shouldn't casually give them more work like this. Also, I hope that you would also apologize to Miss Afri. Your actions startled her, Jerry. Lionel turned back and opened the door, disappearing into the home. The young man fell into silence. He didn't seem too shocked and he didn't even look angry. He seemed quite difficult to read. Even after the door closed, he didn't say much, looking back toward the unicorn demon corpse. Still, although he didn't say much, didn't mean that Athri wouldn't. She stomped her feet angrily, her cheeks practically puffing as though she was a toddler. She didn't look like much of a young lady at all. Or maybe she looked exactly like one depending on how you viewed such noble young women. He's always so rude. The young man looked back to Athri. He already had some guesses of his own, but Athri's words seemed to expose some more stuff. He was actually a bit curious about a person who was clearly here in the same capacity as himself, but dared to be so rude to Athri. Do you know him? Of course I know him. He's just a bunny. Athri was about to expose Lionel as a male escort, but she suddenly remembered her grandmother's stern reprimand from earlier. Her grandmother rarely got so cold with her, but whenever she did, it was very important. Bunny? The young man raised his eyebrows. Forget it, he was just a servant yet he's so arrogant. Grandma invited him into the family, but he actually dared to glare at Grandma. The young man's heart skipped a beat. What had Athri just said? He tended to believe what the young mistress was saying, but in that case, why was Lionel still alive? For the first time he became serious. He's so full of himself. He thinks he's so great just because he looks a little good. Of course, he doesn't look as good as you, Slayton. He just has an overinflated ego. Slayton smiled lightly at this, but didn't say much. Objectively, there was no gap between his looks and Lionel's. They were both quite handsome. Clearly, Athri just didn't like Lionel. And it seemed more due to the fact that he had been rude to her rather than because Lionel had been rude to her grandmother. Interesting. Anyway, let's go. You promised to take me out of the estate today. I didn't get to have all my fun last time. What did you say? Mistress Olidark's uninterested expression changed. She looked up toward the shadow making the report. In the end, the shadow could only reiterate what happened. A single spear strike for a 5-star demon. That much is shocking, but still acceptable within the realms. A single spear strike for a tier 1 6-star middle demon while in the 5th star. Mistress Olidark didn't know how to accept this information. She asked question after question, but in the end, the only response the shadow seemed to have for her is that it looked like a profound spear technique. A profound spear technique could bridge the gap between the 5th and 6th star? Mistress Olidark didn't know how to take this. Did you find information on this Morales family? From the moment she learned of this family name, she had sent the Dark Branch on a task. But when it came to destroyed families, she had to be exceptionally cautious. The web of ties and interests associated with such a fall could become very complex, very quickly. And now, judging from this technique, it might be even more complicated than she had originally thought. The more powerful this Morales family, the more trouble there could be lurking in the shadows. If it was bad enough, Mistress Olidark would even have to cut her losses and kill Lionel directly. If Lionel brought their family more trouble than help, then there was no use in keeping him around. Raising up the only remaining heir of a destroyed family, especially if that family was powerful, was like raising a ticking time bomb. We have been cautious, making sure that no one can follow our traces, so progress is slow. We haven't found anything yet. It likely will be several months before we find anything. I see. In all likelihood, since the brat dared to appear here, and even speak out his family name, it's either he's arrogant and overestimates himself, or that there are no enemies that can threaten him here. Forget it for now, let him reap his rewards and keep him happy. The more he works, the better. Before he knows it, he'll be helping our Olidark family far more than he's taking from us. The shadow nodded and turned to leave. Left to her own devices, Mistress Olidark's gaze narrowed, her mind still on the profound spear technique. If it was good enough, she would also force Lionel to hand it over. Since they were sheltering him, the price he paid couldn't be allowed to be too small. Chapter 1523. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:34 and 1 p.m. Chapter 1523. Dream Unify. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Sorry for the super late chaps everyone. I didn't like how Chapter 2 and 3 came out originally, so I rewrote them since they were important. Anywho, onward. Lionel entered the library of the Olidark family, without even checking in with Mistress Olidark. He didn't feel the need to show such courtesy. He had done his job, now it was time to reap the rewards they would very soon regret giving him. If they thought that restricting his reading time would really work, they were sorely mistaken. Very few had ever outright guessed what Lionel's ability was. And as his lineage factors grew more powerful, it got even more difficult to tell. Those of the dimensional verse had an easier time because they knew which families he was born from and could, as such, deduce which of his strengths came from them. But those in this zone clearly had no idea, or so Lionel hoped. This world was too unlike the one he was used to. Since this was a zone, it was definitely a point in history at some time or another. So the idea that a Morales family could exist here wasn't impossible. But Lionel just wasn't sure. The main reason for his confusion was precisely their naming convention for the dimensions. A name might sound insignificant, but after what Lionel learned about constellations, he started to pay more attention to them. Also, even if he didn't care to do this, the change was far too jarring. Lionel was no longer the ignorant pup he had been in the beginning. After reading so many books from the Void Library, his knowledge foundation was far too solid. This was why he knew that in the history of the human domain, no one had ever called the dimensions stars. This was a jarring realization alone, one that Lionel was firmly grappling with. It was something he obviously had to accept, but it was also just as hard to do so. The implications weren't something that he even knew how to wrap his head around. There was, of course, the possibility that this wasn't the human domain at all. He had only seen a small segment of this world, after all. What if there were other races acting as overlord? P1E's visit N0V1B NE. The issue was he had never heard of demons either. Such creatures, especially since they seemed so tied to the anarchic force of this world, should have definitely been detailed in the Void Library. After all, it had detailed every other race. Plus, there was the fact that this anarchic force was far more powerful than what Lionel was used to, even being capable of attacking the mind. How could there be anarchic force more powerful than what you could find on a void battlefield? It didn't make sense. There was an obvious answer to all of this. This was a mythological zone. It was the only answer that made sense to Lionel, and he gave it a better than 97% probability to be the case. This had to be a mythological zone based on a myth of the human domain, one that Lionel wasn't familiar with. It's not like the Void Library would house fairy tales in it, so it was very much possible that Lionel wouldn't be aware of it. Since Lionel was born and raised on Earth, there were many obvious things to others that probably wouldn't be so obvious to him. Lionel shook his head. Regardless of what this place was, he needed more information. And he would have to source that information from this place. The Olidark library was quite bright. It had a dome of glass as though it was a greenhouse rather than a library, and it had countless shelves, even the shortest of which were twice Lionel's height. These short shelves were located on the far walls though. The main shelves were grandly used as centerpieces, towering upwards of 20 or so meters, and have dozens of ladders between them to accommodate those that might want to reach books near the top. The library was separated into general knowledge sections and technique sections, the latter second giving off a much more profound pressure in Lionel's direction. Lionel was given exactly 1 hour for his efforts. Though no one had stopped his march here, he was absolutely certain that they were monitoring this. They wouldn't let him take any more, lest they believe him to be getting too full of himself. Such a large store of knowledge couldn't possibly be consumed in just an hour. They expected Lionel to have to work harder and harder for his time and his benefits. Practically the only thing they would give him for free was food, water, and a place to stay, with no guarantee for any of them to be worth much of anything. Well, a normal person, anyway. This wasn't the Void Library that forced Lionel to construct and organize his own network. This was a library, already properly organized, and written not even on pendants, but on sheets of paper. It was almost too easy. Lionel walked to the first shelf and ran his fingers along the books, looking at the spine of each one as though he was looking for something in particular. An hour later, He had touched every book in the library and he walked out just as the final second ticked down. There might as well have not been anyone else around him as he didn't spare any of them a single glance. In fact, there were even times he walked up to individuals already reading a book, just to check the cover without a word. He didn't know why this world that seemed so much more powerful was using such primitive methods, but he also didn't care. Even if they had used pendants, it would have been just as easy. Lionel didn't give anyone the opportunity to reprimand or find fault with him. He simply left, turning through several corridors and hallways until he found his supposed room once again. The door clicked closed behind him and fell to the floor, snoring away without a care. As he slept, his mind quickly organized itself. His mind of fluttering books moving about as though they had minds of their own. Dream Unify. Chapter 1524. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1524. Faded. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The ease was too great. Lionel had a half-foot radius around his body in which his starry spirit domain could function without activating his bloodline. All he needed to do was touch something, and so long as it was compact enough, it would functionally, for all intents and purposes, be within his dream world. And once that happened, everything was fair game. Lionel no longer had to consciously use Dream Sculpt to transfer something into his dream world now. This saved him time, effort and stamina. On top of this, he was also able to copy things that would have usually been far beyond his means in the past as well. All that was left now was to organize them. And that was where Dream Unify came into being. Sleeping was the ultimate organization effort. Lionel realized that rather than wasting time doing it all himself, he could allow the natural functions of his body to take hold of its own processes. With the middleman cut out, not only would he be able to rest, but the process would also be far faster. Like this, the first dream ability where Lionel would truly be asleep was born. And just like that, his mind began to whir at seemingly inhuman speeds, rapidly categorizing everything into memories as though he had personally read it all. When it was done, Lionel opened his eyes. He entered the shower, washed him of the demon blood that had covered him, and then sat cross-legged on his bed. His expression was frighteningly cold, the picture of concentration, even the temperature of the room seemed to plummet. But that all vanished when he closed his eyes. The knowledge assimilated into Lionel, and he exhaled a long breath. The first thing he looked toward was the information about demons. According to this, demons came in different ranks. The one he had just fought was known as a middle demon. Lower, middle and higher demons were all collectively known as low-class demons. Beyond low-class demon were, unsurprisingly, middle-class demons. They were separated into uncommon demon, rare demons and elite demons. These demons usually had real names and species to go with them, and were less reliant on sudden mutation. They also tended to be more beautiful. One would think that this was all, but beyond this there were still high-class demons, humanoid demons, fiend demons and chaos demons, each of which had divisions of their own, enough for 18 subclasses, with each one having a large gap between them. Lionel found this especially hard to wrap his head around. If a low-class demon was actually so powerful, then what about a middle-class demon? What about a humanoid demon? A chaos demon? Lionel might have defeated the unicorn demon in just a single strike, but he had used at least 30% of his strength. While this might shock the Olidark family, to him this meant that he was far too lacking. There were definitely people in this world capable of fighting these demons, or else the human race would have already long since been overrun. Just by Lionel's initial calculations, if he needed 30% of his strength already, that meant that at best, right now he could fight a Tier 1 6-star uncommon demon. He didn't have a chance against a rare demon, let alone a high-class demon or beyond. And that was if he could go all out. Of course, Lionel was still in the 5th dimension. Or rather the 5th star. But he felt that even if he had a perfect breakthrough, the best he'd be able to do was face the best of the high-class demons. At the same level, he really didn't think he'd be a match for a humanoid demon of the lowest level. And there were still 8 more subclasses to go. Just what was this world? This wasn't a matter of raw strength, this was a matter of talent. Pure talent. The reason Lionel couldn't fight these demons wasn't because they were more powerful. It was because they were far more talented than him. And by proxy, this meant that there were also humans here far more talented than him. Lionel suddenly felt a tingling sensation. Even though his eyes were still closed, his lips couldn't help but spread into a grin. It was a wild, unrestrained grin that only seemed to grow wilder by the second. How interesting. When Wise Star Order told him that there were plenty of people out there that were more talented than him, he had believed it. But when he entered the Void Palace, he was fairly disappointed. His excitement came, but then it fizzled out just as quickly. Things just became uninteresting to him. If it wasn't for the Green Thread faction antagonizing him, he probably wouldn't have bothered with much other than preparing himself for the air war. After all, Lionel had yet to revive his friends, and he still had a lot of work to do toward building a faction in the future. He didn't have time to play petty games. Though defeating the Green Thread faction would have actually netted him quite a bit, and thus made it worth it. Still, Lionel had resigned himself to that boredom. Of course, Lionel had also yet to meet the true geniuses of the Void Palace. He hadn't met the previous Amethyst token wielders, nor had he fought Amory at his full strength. And he also hadn't faced off against the members of his generation after they broke through to the 6th dimension. But he still could only deal with what was right in front of him. And nothing that had been in front of him excited him aside from his grandfather's way of the spear. Ironically, though, his mastering a portion of that only made things more boring. Now, though, Lionel couldn't help but realize that if he hadn't mastered calligraphy, what would have become of him? Let alone a middle-class demon? Would he have even been capable of defeating a low-class demon? The appearance of this zone had been so abrupt and sudden. There was no time to prepare. He was simply thrust into this situation without cause or warning. What if his uncle had let him run away that day? Or what if this zone appeared a year earlier? Lionel's grin faded. The problem with his mindset seemed to become more glaring to him every day. Chapter 1525. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1525. 1 month. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel knew that it wasn't his ice control that had gotten Mistress Olidark's attention. It might have caused her to perk up a bit, but it wasn't until he displayed his spear force that she decided against killing him, and took him in. For all Lionel knew, if he hadn't learned this way of the spear, he would have been killed on the spot, never to see the next day. It was quite a sobering thought. No. ELBI? ETA part of Lionel still believed that he would have found a way to escape. But as a person who claimed to be so rational, these thoughts of his were wholly irrational. He didn't even realize that he had had such inner thoughts until Aina pointed them out to him, but now it felt so obvious. It was no wonder his dad laughed at him when he talked about being a king. A king, of course, needed confidence. But didn't that confidence need to be built on something? Lionel thought that he was. After all, his mind was his most powerful asset. He believed that he could think and smart his way out of any situation, even if he lacked the raw strength. Even his dream class ratings were based on this. But wasn't that all theoretical? Lionel opened his eyes and looked out of the window. There was no sky, no clouds, hardly any sunlight. It was just a wall to what was probably another big house or mansion in the estate. An estate that was essentially nothing more than a cage to him. Lionel suddenly remembered that day on the battlefield. Heavy rain fell from the skies. One by one, friends that he had held so dear for 2 years fell, their blood mixing into the mud and returning to the earth. Every death was like an added weight on his shoulder, a deeper sort of promise that he swore to keep. But what if that was the real world? There would be no reviving them. It would be too late to regret his weakness. Right now he was stuck in this world, stuck in this cage. His mother was out there. The woman he loved was out there. His brothers were out there. And he was here because he was too weak to leave to go to find them. They said that the human mind was good at forgetting and glossing over tragedy. It was also pretty good at forgetting that one day would all die, something that quite a scary proposition. entering an unknown abyss on the other side. And yet people still managed to live day to day with a smile on their faces. Lionel thought that he was different. He believed himself to be some logically superior being. Even his moral compass was kept dear to him, as though he was blessing the world with his kindness. He couldn't find a reason to place the worth of his life above another, so he might as well consider himself their equals. It made him sound like a prick when you put it like that. And maybe he was one. Clearly he wasn't much different from anyone else. That traumatic day he experienced in the Valiant Heart Zone. That day when all his thinking, all his planning, all his logic, all his intelligence, all his smarts was worth not a damn thing. He seemed to have just casually forgotten it. And why? All because he could just revive them with a tablet? It was quite funny when he thought about it. He couldn't find a reason to place one life above another, but didn't this tablet that could revive the dead do so easily? Wasn't there a different energy requirement for reviving each person? If there was no intrinsic worth, then wouldn't they all be worth the same price? Why did he still care then? His life was worth more than theirs, and these high-class demons were worth more than him. What was the point anymore? This tablet could obviously accomplish something he could not, so clearly it knew better than him about the secrets of life. Wasn't that the logical conclusion? With his intelligence, shouldn't he have thought of that problem long ago? So why had he rejected it? Lionel turned his head away from the window and closed his eyes once more. He took deep and steady breaths. He never really hesitated to give worth to people. Most would hesitate to say which parent or child they loved more. And yet Lionel felt pretty clearly that he favored his dad. Most would never sit idly by as the woman they loved was married off to another man. And yet he had, and he was even smiling in his own little world all the while. Most wouldn't try to logically understand things that were clearly beyond their means. And yet he tried to do so all the time. It was like he was also trying to fit puzzle pieces into places he knew they didn't fit, stubbornly and arrogantly jamming them in again and again, yet still being unsatisfied with the result. What did all of this mean? What was the answer? Where had he gone wrong? Or was he even wrong at all? Lionel didn't have an answer. It was all too complicated, even for him. He didn't even know where to start. He suddenly felt the strong urge to see his father again, to see his mother, his uncle, his Aina. He felt lost, his previous feelings of eagerness vanishing. Those words James spoke to him all those years ago. The same words Aina repeated without ever having heard them before. How right were they? Am I wrong? Lionel's soft whisper was like an eerie whistle in the wind, following the current and bouncing off the walls. There was no response. However, something still seemed to echo in Lionel's ears. A king? What a joke. Your old man's still alive. At best, you can be a little prince. The words echoed again and again like a flickering candlelight in Lionel's mind. Snap. The sound shook the estate, the skies above rumbling with thunder. But Lionel didn't even notice. It was as though everyone in the world was shaken but him. He only felt that his thoughts ran faster and his ability index seemed to have improved again, but he felt that that was only because he had just stepped into Tier 7. He didn't have an answer, but he still had a path. No one would stop him from getting out of here. 1 month. In 1 month no one here would be able to stop him. Chapter 1526. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 1526. Stars. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel entered a state of unprecedented focus, his mind reaching a state of tranquility as he began to focus on what would most help to achieve his goal. The magic system of this world. The books were far more complex than Lionel had originally given them credit for. While they didn't store their information in pendants, the pages of their books held a special magical ability to hide and store more information than their dimensions would seem to allow. For the more complex books, it wasn't surprising to get several normal books worth of information on just a single page or two. Regardless, the introduction of this world's magic system was fairly simple, or overly complex depending on how you looked at it. If Lionel had to describe it in just a few words, It was as though all of the most important branches of power systems in the dimensional verse had been combined into a singular discipline. Quite frankly, if it wasn't because Lionel was so focused, he just might gasp in amazement. The magic or power system of this world was predicated on stars. And these stars were designed with the constellation realm of the universal cycles in mind. From birth, the people of this world were innately born from anywhere from 0 to 3 stars. In truth, these weren't true stars but could be considered a precursor. These stars would be very small and immature. Depending on several factors, these stars would also dictate everything about your talent. Those who could not use the force of this world were usually born with 0 stars. When Lionel thought to this point, he obviously couldn't help but turn his mind toward dimensional cleanse. Could this be the reason he could use his force here while the others could not? Lionel had no real way of knowing if this was true or not, but what he did know was that the formation of stars in this world beyond birth required much more effort than what he had put in. If it was really because of dimensional cleanse, it just didn't seem to make sense. If the stars of dimensional cleanse and the stars of this world were equivalent in function and nature, then shouldn't he be a powerhouse? He already had 8 stars. How could the likes of Mistress Olidark possibly match him? In addition, the formation of stars in this world was reliant on a complex step-by-step process. By the nature of things in this place, you could only form 1 star for every 9 tiers you climbed. Well, for every set of tiers, that is. In this world, it actually depended. In this world, you have the right to practice in force only if you were born with at least 1 star. Only then would you have the chance to form a 2nd and 3rd and truly begin on your journey. And it was only upon forming your 3rd star that you could begin to try and enter this world's 4th dimensional equivalent. This meant one very obvious thing. The hunters that Lionel had met when he first entered this world weren't even 4th dimensional existences. He couldn't fathom the fact that this was true, so he hadn't even been able to see through this. From this point, once your 3rd star was formed, you could begin to grow and nurture your stars via the formation of your force nodes. In this way, this process worked exactly like it had when Lionel was in the 3rd dimension. In fact, the 4th dimension and 5th dimension worked exactly the same ways as well. In the 3rd star, one would form their nodes. With every node formation, the more compatible the location was with you, the higher resonance it would have with your stars, and the more growth it would have. The size of your node and the location were the greatest factors, just like in the dimensional verse. So long as your node was large and compatible, your stars would resonate and grow. The formation of each node would start a new resonance and growth period. Once this period ended, you could then form your next node. Just like in the dimensional verse as well, many couldn't form all 9 of their nodes and wouldn't gain the benefit of 9 resonances. As such, the stars would remain in a more infant-like state for longer before reaching maturity and beginning to display their true strength. This process would repeat in the 4th dimension, but with the addition of a 4th star. This time, as you formed your nodal pathways, your stars would resonate and grow. And then again in the 5th dimension, or rather the 5th star. Every time you unshackled your mind to a new tier, your stars would resonate, and they would grow in strength. Finally, you would be standing before the 6th dimension. And here was where everything would change, and the fascinating aspects of this power system would begin to manifest itself. In this world, the 4 seasons realm did not exist. In addition, the heavenly body, natural light, cosmos, and constellation realms took on a new form entirely. Lionel couldn't begin to understand why this was, but what he did know was that the people of this world built everything on the backs of their stars. As one might have guessed by this point, the constellation of the constellation realm, the ultimate level sought after by all, would be formed by the stars within your body itself. The power of such a thing was unimaginable. It was no longer an illusion, but rather a tangible representation of might stored within the walls of your body. The difference was akin to night and day. But this wasn't just the case for the constellation realm. This would continue to be true for each and every realm. There was no God path or convention path in this world, or rather, they didn't appear in the same form. Rather, the two seemed to combine into a new discipline that revolved around stars. Chapter 1527. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1527. Final hurdle: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. How was it that the magic system accomplished this? It was actually quite simple. Once a star reached maturity, it could begin to be projected outward in a show of strength and power. The existence of a star was like having a nuclear plant at the core of your body. The amount of energy it could pull in and suck toward itself from the outside world was immense. And its ability to do so would only grow as you nurtured it past maturity into an untouched, elite state. Before a star ever became part of your constellation, you could, just like in the God path, use it as a medium to manifest God runes. In this world, however, these were called star runes. This was the extent to which Lionel understood the God path of the dimensional verse, for he couldn't draw any more comparisons than that. But it was still enough for him to paint a picture and understand what was going on. Upon entering the sixth star in this world, you could finally begin to comprehend the heavenly body realm. Upon doing so and forming your own path, you are thus able to manifest your stars. Of course, the number of stars you could manifest was based on a number of factors. Whether they were mature or not was one matter, but another was the limit of your talent and comprehension. Some could only sustain one star while others could sustain all of theirs. Those that could do the latter were definitely the pinnacle of talents in this world. In truth, it was quite average to only be capable of manifesting one star. In fact, this was downplaying it. If you could manifest one star at the sixth dimension, you were considered a genius. If you only unlocked and gained the ability to manifest one more for every dimension you climbed, you would be able to maintain your stamp as a genius. Those that could manifest two were shocking, while those that could manifest three or more were mostly unheard of. These numbers would all tick up by one for every step forward in strength a person took, and for every realm they crossed. In this world, the natural light realm was also different. It represented a state your stars could enter where the skies would darken, and the only light that remained was them. It would feel as though night had been cast upon the land before it was blessed with the day once more. This was the representation of the monstrosity of power a seventh star held. It was as though they could dictate the laws themselves. Upon reaching the cosmos realm, the phenomena would become even more exaggerated. One star would break apart and form many small motes of light, dotting the skies across and blanketing a battlefield. It was a sight that one would need to see to believe. The process of entering the constellation realm was a reformation of your stars into 9 cores. These 9 cores and their orbiters would take form to become your constellation. These so-called orbiters were pieces of your stars that you failed to bring back together. The closer to the number 9 your constellation was, the more powerful it was. These were all things far beyond Lionel, and he had no business thinking about them, but he was in a bind. He thought that by reading through the materials of the oligarchs, he would be able to find the method to break into the God path. After all, if this was a zone, the system should be similar enough. In fact, since it was a mythological zone, it should be even better. This would mean that Lionel would have an even better magic system to take advantage of. But the main issue here was that, well, there were several. For one, he already had 8 stars. How exactly was he going to form his 6th exactly? Didn't he already pass that by? Also, if it was the case that dimensional cleanse wasn't related to this world at all, and he was being ridiculous, wasn't that even worse? That meant he had no stars at all, and the minimum requirement for beginning in any method was to have at least 1. Stars were able to harness and quickly gather energy, but if you had no stars, then there was nothing to gather energy for you. All of the methods that Lionel had memorized from the oligarch family followed this line of logic as well, and their methods of breaking into the 6th star required him to resonate his 5 stars to catalyze the birth of a new one. No matter how you looked at it, there was nothing but a blocked road ahead. However, at the moment, Lionel was unprecedentedly calm. He already knew what he would have to do. If he had to choose between this and the lives of the people he cared about, the answer was too obvious. He didn't even need to think about it. If dimensional cleanse was really the reason he could use force in this world, then that meant that his mother and Aina were especially helpless, not to mention his friends and brothers. Without his help, They would be helpless. He needed the strength to leave this place, and the fifth dimension wouldn't give it to him. He needed to break into the sixth. Unfortunately, he didn't have the method to enter the God path, so there was only one choice. He would enter the sixth dimension through the conventional path. Once Lionel made his decision, he did not hesitate. For the first time in a long time, he brought forward the natural force art of the dimensional cleanse. Until now, he had been relying on his innate node to break the shackles of his mind, and had never needed to use it, but it was about time he brought it forward. Before losing to Amory, Lionel passed 3 rounds of the trials, so in his mind currently, he had the 5th dimensional layer and the 6th dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse. He would use the former to reach the peak of the 5th star as quickly as possible, and then use the latter to break through the final hurdle. Chapter 1528. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1528. Neither if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The visualization of the 5th dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse used to overwhelm Lionel, but now it didn't feel like so any longer. He felt that it would only take him about a single week to not only grasp it, but to fully comprehend this layer like he had done with the 4th dimensional layer. In this way, he would be able to pass it along to others. Lionel took this ability to pass on dimensional cleanse, more importantly than ever now that he felt it might be related to his current freedom in this world. After a glance at it, Lionel hesitated. This wasn't because he felt that he had chosen wrong, but rather because he wasn't sure what would happen if he suddenly began to practice now. What Lionel didn't know is that the commotion caused earlier by the sudden snap had whisked away all the experts of the oligarch family. It wasn't just them, but a high-level meeting the likes of which hadn't occurred in tens of thousands of years was called. The last time such a meeting was called, it was due to the descent of a chaos demon. This was how rare such an event was, and for those people to send down such an order, all those of the 7th star and above were forced to acknowledge the call. The only ones that remained to monitor the home were the 6 stars of the oligarch family. Unbeknownst to him, Lionel had given himself his own lucky chance. But had he been aware, he might have had far too many questions to ever think of focusing. In the end, Lionel shook his head. It didn't make sense for him to bother trying to hide his activities. This was his bed, he had to lie in it. He didn't believe his skill was high enough to draw a force art capable of concealing what he was doing. Well, he might have had the skill, but he was lacking in the necessary power. Let them watch then. Don't choke. A cold light flickered in Lionel's gaze, and he focused once more. The complex, spherical gear system of the natural force art visualization reflected in his mind, and even appeared in his irises. It felt like it could calculate all the variables of the world with a single input, a machine of strokes, gears, and pipes so enormous that there was nothing it couldn't accomplish. However, this complex machine became like nothing more than a pile of individual parts to Lionel. Without even meditating upon it a single time, it was as though he could dissect it and put it all back together. Lionel's millions of minds took each one of these pieces as their own, and then began to comprehend them simultaneously. 1. At that moment, Lionel re-established himself in Tier 1 of the 5th dimension, grasping the essence of the visualization to that level in just a few minutes, not even a set of 10 of which had passed. Lionel's stars reacted fiercely, their rotation speed increasing by several folds and their sizes increasing explosively. Lionel was caught so off guard that he could only watch in silence as large amounts of force surged toward him like a tide. The silver stars, now constructed of dream force, were like a dried ocean bed finally receiving a heavy rain. They glowed such a bright light that even though they were within Lionel's own mind, he felt like he couldn't even look at them properly. The blue stars, charged of raging vital star force, became like greedy tornadoes, forcing large amounts of vital star force, that should have been a rare energy, through the nodal pathways in Lionel's body, through his spine, into the node of his brainstem, charging through his brain and into his ethereal glabella. And then there were the fierce red-gold stars. Strands of scarlet star force that Lionel had struggled to budge, and move gathered in such thick quantities that they manifested in the air like threads of gorgeous silk. Despite following the same path the Dream Force and Vital Star Force had, Lionel didn't feel any pain at all. In fact, it was as though he had been refreshed, his innate nodes even glowing with a fiercer light. Right then, it was as though the whole Dark estate was quaking. Lionel continued to watch this scene, not quite understanding what was happening. According to what he knew, Dimensional Cleanse was a special take that could be practiced alongside other ones. However, there shouldn't have been such a large difference here. At the very least, you shouldn't benefit as though you were truly breaking into the same realm twice. If things were like that, then everyone would insist on practicing Dimensional Cleanse, no matter what. This was why Lionel had never really stressed about using the visualization to break through. In fact, using his innate node to break through was more beneficial for him in the long run, and he could always use the visualization later. Somehow, though, this singular breakthrough still felt like an enormous watershed. Lionel could only ignore it. He was still worried about being interrupted, so he wanted to gain as much as he could before others insisted on interfering. However, what he hadn't known was that the force was so violent and dense that no one dared to get close. Or, more accurately, anyone who would have dared wasn't present to begin with. In this world, atmospheric force wasn't just more difficult to control, but when it appeared in large concentrations, it was dangerous for those that followed the star path, especially if the force followed a path that they did not. Lionel blazed through the fifth dimension once more. By the third day he had already stepped into Tier 6, by the fourth Tier 7. By the fifth he broke through once again, finally entering Tier 8. And exactly 1 week later, just like he planned, he sat at the border of Tier 9, ready to break the final veil and form his 9th star. However, at that moment, Lionel paused. There was a secret here he knew he hadn't quite grasped, but there was also an opportunity. Lionel took a breath, a roar leaving his lips. At that moment, the sound of a final shattering barrier resounded, and the 9th star began to form in Lionel's mind. However, there wasn't one star core, there were two, and neither of them were red gold. Chapter 1529. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1529. Fusion. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. If there was anything Lionel knew how to do, it was to take advantage of a situation. Whether it was in his daily life or even his battle style, everything was predicated on capitalizing on a moment of opportunity, a moment of weakness, or even a moment of enlightenment. Over the last week, Lionel felt like his mind was constantly getting refreshed and constantly strengthening. Not only had it allowed him to stay awake and not rest a single time, but it also made him sharper and faster, his mind growing even more powerful than it had been before. No, it was more like his mind was finally gaining the proper fuel, blessed with a refreshing amount and quality of force it had never experienced before. As the dream force surged in, Lionel felt that his base starry spirit domain was slowly growing millimeter by millimeter. At the same time, as his vital star force stars rumbled with life, the feeling of vitality coursing through his veins was absolutely intoxicating. It was as though someone was pouring the purest ambrosia of the gods into his heart, allowing every pump to send it throughout his body. His lifespan was quickly expanding, but better yet, his healing factor seemed to have grown supercharged. As though this wasn't enough, his star fusion self-created technique, one he rarely used due to all its limitations, seemed to grow endlessly powerful. Lionel couldn't even spare the mental power to think about the implications of such a change. The time it would take to recharge his star fusion technique might not even be a fraction of what it once was. In fact, it even seemed that he might not have to wait for it to recharge at all. Of all of these stars, though, the most special was without a doubt Lionel's Scarlet Star Force twin stars. When they began absorbing the Scarlet Star Force toward them, filling themselves up like someone who had suffered through a famine, its changes were far more profound than Lionel's other stars. Not only did it feel as though its growth capacity was far beyond that of his other stars, Lionel also watched in awe as it began to quickly form its own runes. One after another, they manifested in the large mass of swirling, hot, red gold gas. Lionel didn't need to think much to be certain that these must be star runes as opposed to the god runes of the dimensional verse. Unlike others who didn't have innate node, Lionel's star runes formed automatically based on his comprehended innate node. Not only that, but because they were the truest and most natural form of destruction runes, they were far beyond anything the comprehension a living creature could possibly form. How could a person match up to the genius of the evolution of the world at large? After countless trillions of years of trial and order, the perfect and final state of these star runes were finally created, and now they formed under the control of Lionel, radiating out with such violent energies that Lionel's bed crumbled to ashes despite him not releasing them, his bedroom's floors and walls beginning to grow with cracks. The entire process couldn't have been more magical or any more mystical. Lionel had never felt the presence of his innate node, or rather innate nodes, so clearly. It was as though they were muffled and yelling for his attention previously, only for their roars to finally reach his ears now. At that moment, new destruction runes quickly formed in Lionel's eyes. His eyelids glowed with a blinding red-gold light, barely holding them back. Lionel had already comprehended 729 destruction runes, but that couldn't even be said to have been under his own effort. It had happened while he was unconscious. But this time he couldn't have been more conscious. In fact, he experienced every bit of this magical feeling. From 729 he crossed 1000, then 2000. With every set of 9 that formed, they would combine. With every set of 81 they would combine one more. With every set of 729, they would combine once again, dancing in Lionel's irises and becoming more and more profound with every passing second. The estate quaked uncontrollably. The overload of destruction runes would have shattered the foundation of any other location in the city. But the Olidark estate was the most fortified location there was outside of the city walls themselves. Lionel's heart pumped with wild abandon. His destruction rune formation caused such a commotion that it was hard to pay attention to just what was happening to the other parts of his body. But those changes were just as profound even though they had far more room to grow. As the dream force pumped throughout him, Lionel felt that his mind was growing stronger. It wasn't just his internal sight and starry spirit domain, it was something deeper, as though even his lineage factors themselves were being fueled and evolved. His spear domain lineage factor, predominantly located in his mind, seemed to expand and become more complex. His king's might flourished, the small violet humanoid figure that used to be its form growing larger and more detailed. It formed its own armor, holding a bow in one hand and a spear in the other. It stood valiantly in the recesses of Lionel's mind, brimming with fighting will. His starry-tailed fox lineage factor's wisdom branch flourished, the boundaries of his mind becoming sturdier, and its expanse became wider. Somehow, these breakthroughs were pushing the boundaries of already defined limits to lineage factors that had always been with Lionel. But that was just what Dreamforce had done. When the vital star force got a hold of Lionel, the changes to his mind began to fuse with the now coming changes to his body. It was as though everything was coming together as one, leaving no stone unturned and forming a perfect and whole product. Lionel's body was put under the constant pressure of evolution, his strengths fusing together into a whole that the former version of himself couldn't hope to compare to. Chapter 1530. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1530. A realization: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As the blue force flooded Lionel's veins, the development of his spear domain in his mind evolved. The neural connections between them and his body grew thicker and more numerous. Muscle memory that Lionel had already formed becoming far more refined, perfect, and even more reflexive than before. At the same time, Lionel's king's might surged into his body. A royal air bloomed from Lionel unconsciously, his bearing and presence alone exuding a pressure that blanketed the estate. It felt as though violet clouds were gathering above. A beautiful scenery that many only wanted to bow to appeared. The silhouette of a humanoid donned in armor, and holding a bow and spear appeared to Lionel's back, only to fuse with his body. The intangible feeling suddenly became tangible. almost as though now every one of Lionel's actions held within it an artistic intention. While this was happening, the speed and healing branch of Lionel's starry-tailed fox lineage factor thrummed with life and vitality. Even without moving a single inch, Lionel knew that his speed had increased by more than tenfold, his already ridiculous healing factor also increasing once more. Now, whereas the limit was healing from 7th-dimensional injuries, Lionel felt he could instantly heal from 8th-dimensional injuries. On top of this, he also felt that he could use instant recovery, not just once but 3 times a day. Still, the largest changes were to the most directly body-related lineage factor of them all, Lionel's metal synergy bloodline. His bronze runes reacted as though they had been stuffed with stimulants. Lionel's cells became more compact and began to give off a bluish-bronze hue of their own. His body had already been strong enough to match Tier 9 bronze treasures, or even quasi-silver treasures, but the strength it was giving off now transcended that. Lionel felt that he had definitely crossed the 6th-dimensional barrier despite his body still being within the 5th. The changes came in waves and they seemed unending. And yet, rather than becoming more complex, it felt like they were all slowly coming together, revolving around the very same path from the very beginning, as though there was only ever one real path to follow in the first place. Every breakthrough in Tyr was like another step in evolution. Rather than just the shackles of his mind being undone as was customary for the 5th dimension, it felt like his entire being was being unshackled. By the end of it, Lionel had such a clear vision of what he wanted that he didn't even hesitate to forget everything he knew and form 10 stars instead of 9. Lionel realized that the only reason his 7th and 8th stars were made of Scarlet Star Force was because he had made it so by using his innate nodes to break through as he had done. However, that didn't mean that he was locked down toward a single path. In fact, if he formed his 9th and 10th stars with Scarlet Star Force as well, it would almost be overkill. The way Lionel saw it, the setup of his stars were perfect currently. N0. ELBI? NET he had 3 of Dream Force. This would work to reinforce and power his ability index and his strongest weapon, his mind. He had 3 for Vital Star Force. He had known from the very beginning how important his body would be to him. This was why he had formed his innate nodes as he had, 1 in the brainstem, 2 down the spine, 2 in his heart, 2 in his lungs, 2 in his kidneys and 1 in his stomach. This configuration was perfect for fueling the strength of his body and revitalizing it. With 3 such stars, this would be supplemented well. But why would he need 4 Scarlet Star Force stars? He already had 2 nodes and 2 stars, for centers from which he could pull from. He definitely didn't need 6 and it wouldn't make him any more powerful. In fact, it might lead to a situation where he was being harmed by his own strength instead. So, instead, Lionel helped fuel the final thing he needed, the very thing he would need to balance his Scarlet Star Force. Lionel had been worrying about exactly how to form a source of this energy for a long while, and he didn't expect for it to fall in his lap like this. And now, he happened to have just enough dark and water force affinity to trigger its appearance. In the dimensional verse, Lionel wouldn't dare to do this. The quantity of force was too small and too low quality. It was difficult for him to find Vital Star Force and Scarlet Star Force to use. However, what these last 7 days had taught him was that this world was very different. It somehow had an abundance of this force, so much that Lionel was in awe. So he was certain. He was certain that if he tried to form his final 2 stars of Void Star Force, he might be able to succeed. Lionel didn't rely on himself alone. Within the countless books of the Olidark family, they had a description of true star forces and among them, Void Star Force was depicted. Within this depiction, a complex star rune was drawn. This star rune was precisely the most basic rune of Void Star Force, the equivalent of the very first destruction rune Lionel had ever formed. Thanks to this book, Lionel realized something shocking. In his deconstruction of Dimensional Cleanse, Lionel noticed that the individual pieces of the visualization were actually all true state forces. Somehow, the creator of Dimensional Cleanse had created a natural force art capable of fusing together all of the basic true state star runes in existence. That was when Lionel understood. He understood why Dimensional Cleanse could be used with any other technique. It was because it was compatible with every technique to begin with. If Lionel wanted to pull a certain energy toward him, all he needed to do was focus on the rune and have the right affinity. With those two things put together, he would form his 9th and 10th stars. Chapter 1531. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1531. A mistake? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was in a state of unprecedented focus. There was no doubt that the Void Star Force came toward him at a much slower pace than the others had. His affinity with Water Force wasn't high enough to control a true state Water Force as easily as he could Dream Force or Scarlet Star Force. In addition, when he had first formed his connection with Vital Star Force, he had been within a trial where it was quite literally the only force around, making it far easier. Still, while the task was slow, it wasn't impossible. It was only about 1% as fast as the formation of his other stars, but this 1% shouldn't be underestimated. In fact, this 1% was enough for the foundation of the estate to still continue to tremble. Lionel was able to make up with his own weaknesses with his comprehension of the visualization that formed the core of the 5th dimensional layer of Dimensional Cleanse. By this point, he had comprehended it to the point that he could also pass it down to others without restriction. With this comprehension, the Force art had practically become his own, dancing and shifting to the whims of his palms as he pleased and bringing forth the force he asked for obediently. If it wasn't for the fact that Lionel was trying to form 2 stars at once, this level of comprehension would have been enough to net him at least 10% of his maximum speed. But at this point, this no longer mattered. He had already chosen his path. Void Star Force radiated out in the surrounding, a dense and sticky darkness fighting for a balance with Lionel's Scarlet Star Force. Lionel pressed the feeling down. It wasn't time for them to fight yet. Right now he needed balance. 2 kernels formed in his ethereal glabella, his massive mage core twinkling as the leaves of Water Force reacted, beginning to slowly evolve beneath the stronger currents of force. The moment the kernels formed, Lionel knew he had already succeeded. These were likely the infant stages of a star, so as long as he fueled them more, they would grow to the same size as the others. And if he wasn't them to match his Scarlet Star Force stars, he would need to comprehend their void runes. But for now Lionel only focused on enlarging them, and that he did. With every revolution, his affinity grew and the speed increased. In 2 days he had already caught up by half, in 5 it was already at 90%. By the end of the 2nd week, WNG. A ripple shot out from Lionel, a balance becoming forcefully struck between his stars. One side of his body rolled with a dark blue, the other dancing with a red gold. Like fire and water, they twisted around and rejected one another, fighting for supremacy. At that moment, it was surprisingly Lionel's mage core that took center stage, shining a bright light that forced the two to calm, settling down into a calm rhythm. Lionel's eyes snapped open, the almost 6,000 destruction runes in his irises slowly fading, but not before they bore a hole in the wall opposite him, only to be stopped by a hidden protection. Lionel's eyes didn't seem to reflect happiness in the slightest. In fact, his thoughts had already turned toward the 6th dimensional layer of Dimensional Cleanse. Half of his month-long deadline had already passed. He didn't have time to waste. He could sense people rushing toward his room, having finally gotten a chance to burst through the barrier of force, but he completely ignored them. In fact, Lionel's eyes flashed, a strong earth force surging toward him. In just a few seconds, the room around him had become nothing more than a box of metal, fusing the doorway and windows. Lionel had gone from someone who could hardly move the force in this world, to suddenly being able to force such an exaggerated him. "You all wait outside obediently while I break through." Lionel closed his eyes once more. The difficult work had already been done. With the foundation laid, breaking into the 6th dimension was as easy as flipping over a palm. However, when Lionel finally took a look at the 6th dimensional layer, his brows jumped. He stayed silent for a long time before his lips suddenly curled into a smile. It seemed that he was correct. This dimensional cleanse technique, maybe its author really was right to brag so much in their introduction. Click. Lionel walked out of his room, his expression calm and indifferent. However, the scenery he walked into was anything but. The guest house he had been staying in was razed to the ground. In fact, the door he had just shut close behind him slowly fell backward, collapsing with a loud thud. Before Lionel, several individuals stood, among which was Mistress Olidark, whose eyes were narrowed. Right now, Lionel stood like a towering pillar. He wasn't actually so tall and he hadn't even grown a single inch. But something about his presence made him feel like a mountain that had just formed. His pale violet hair and eyes glowed with their own light as though coated with a fluorescent paint. His aura was intoxicating and it seemed to make his features an entire level more attractive. And on top of that, his power 6-star. Mistress Olidark thought. All of this commotion was caused by his breakthrough? She wasn't here to personally witness it. In fact, she had only just come back. But this scene was enough for her to understand. According to reports, no one had been able to step foot within 50 meters of this place for the last 2 weeks. For some reason, Mistress Olidark felt a slight warning in her heart. Had she made a mistake? Her fingers twitched, thinking of killing Lionel right here and now. But when she remembered the meeting she had just been to, she slowly pushed down her killing intent. She still needed him. Bow when you see the mistress. A booming voice cut through the silence, a wild pressure coming toward Lionel's head. Chapter 1532. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1532. To the field. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The voice had quite some power to it. It was as powerful as it was shocking. It was clear that his individual was just as interested in shocking Lionel as he was in displaying his might, looking to do something to break Lionel's momentum. There were several individuals startled by the change, many of whom were much further in the 6-star than Lionel himself. However, what no one could have expected was for Lionel to not react in the slightest. It was as though he hadn't heard the slightest thing. He might have even given a fly buzzing around him more attention than he gave this booming voice. Lionel's mind had already been sharp before his breakthroughs, but now he was on a completely different level. Still, even if he hadn't had these breakthroughs, the momentum someone needed to gather up to shout so loudly was too obvious. Lionel had already caught what would happen the moment this individual took a much deeper than usual breath. By the time they actually shouted, they might as well have been nothing more than a jumping clown. In the past, Lionel didn't really care much about kneeling. He had grown up in an empire that practically deified his grandfather, and to him he never really attached any great importance to it. It was what everyone did, and it didn't have the same weight of stigma attached to it that some parts of history would lead one to believe. However, after his time in the Camelot Zone, he had grown a distaste for it. If the person you were kneeling to didn't have any foul intentions, doing so might still be fine. However, if the person you were kneeling for wanted to use it for no other purpose than stepping over your head, it was something that could easily infuriate Lionel, let alone the fact he wouldn't listen to a jumping clown like that one. Even if no one had said anything, he would never kneel to a person like Mistress Olidark, who clearly had no regard for him. This little outburst, though, did give Lionel a hint of information, though. He hadn't spent very long in the Olidark estate, but he had run into several young men who seemed intent on observing him, especially during his hour in the library. These were all young men, all around the same age, and all of which held a certain standard of talent. It wasn't too difficult to guess what they were doing here. It was like Mistress Olidark had built up her own little army of live-in son-in-laws for her granddaughter to pick and choose from. Such a thing was one part amusing and another part infuriating. The one who had spoken just now was the only one that Lionel had come across that had a presence similar to or more powerful than the young man that had been by Athre's side that day. He had already heard talks around of a Sebastian and Slayton many times already. So he assumed that this person was one of the two of them. Still, Lionel found it funny. These two were supposedly the strongest, and yet they were also the most happy to wag their tails and please. It made Lionel wonder if it was really their talent that made them the strongest, or if it was their boot-licking that just gained them far more resources than everyone else. Of course, while he was insulting them, Lionel thought of another more sinister possibility, and that was that Mistress Olidark had managed to tighten a much shorter leash on these two precisely because of their talent. If that was the case, he needed to be wary of such methods. "Do you all need something?" Lionel asked lightly. His voice was like a light breeze that whisked away the echoes of Sebastian's voice. It was as though the shout itself never happened, but it was precisely this that made things so embarrassing for the latter. "You." Sebastian's mouth snapped close the moment Mistress Olidark raised a hand. By this point, Lionel's lack of respect was grating on her nerves. She might be able to find the amusement in it when it was just the two of them, but when everyone was scrutinizing her like this, it made it 10 times more infuriating than it should have been. "You destroyed all of this?" Mistress Olidark asked. "You never provided me with a proper training room. What else could I destroy if not this?" Rather than becoming more infuriated, Mistress Olidark only became calmer. "The expenses for this guest house and the surrounding damage will come directly from your merits. Until you gather enough to pay it back, the house will not give you any resources." Mistress Olidark expected Lionel to fly into a rage when he heard this, giving her an opportunity to suppress him further. But all she received in return was a curled lip. Merits? Resources? After he had been through their library once, he already had all the information he needed. In fact, it wasn't just information about this that he had gathered. After the breakthrough in his mind, Lionel believed that he had thought of a viable method to shatter the barriers of this zone and catalyze their return home. Of course, this would require resources that he apparently wouldn't be receiving anymore until he met some arbitrary goal. He had no doubt Mistress Olidark would inflate, but it wouldn't have been a good idea to gather said resources from this place to begin with. It would have been too suspicious. P1E's visiti and 0ve1bn. Ne. The simple fact was that he didn't need anything this house could give him any more that he wouldn't be able to get himself when they inevitably forced him to go demon hunting again. In 2 more weeks, just like he said, he would leave this place. Lionel's derisive smile and silence dug into Mistress Olidark's nerves. However, she could only stare at him deeply before she spoke her next words. "Everyone to the training field. Now." Chapter 1533. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1533. Statues. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It wasn't long until everyone had followed Mistress Olidark, and when they heard what was said, their expressions formed various shades of excitement and anticipation. According to Mistress Olidark, she had just gone to a gathering held by the 4 great families. At this meeting, all classified families and organizations were tasked with mandatory attendance to a second gathering, this one designed for what they called a future investment. Lionel had all the books of the Olidark family in his mind, so he knew about the 4 great families. The issue was that he didn't know anything else substantive about them. He read tales of their feats and grandeur, and they were also apparently the final line of defense between the human world and the chaos demons, but that was all Lionel knew. He didn't know the names of these 4 great families, he didn't even know where they were located. The same was the case for Mistress Olidark as well. In truth, this gathering wasn't designed for everyone across the human world. It only encompassed this region, a region they called a bubble. As for why they called it a bubble, it was because a bubble wasn't decided by scope, size, or even arbitrary distinctions or war like most territories were. Rather, a bubble was a point where the spatial spheres of this world and the demon world met. At every one of these points, a set of organizations and families were tasked with defending it in these positions that hung over abysses just like this city. Depending on the contact point to the demon world, you could run into stronger or weaker demons. Likewise, just like demons, these regions were classified as low class, middle class, high class, human class, fiend class, and chaos class, labeling a bubble by its threat level. Though it was possible for a threat to appear that surpassed these threats, it wasn't too common. If such a thing ever happened, help could be called. But it was much more likely for higher-level bubbles to request aid from lower-level ones. This was what happened with Mistress Olidark's husband and son-in-law, which left her to command the house on her own. The bubble that the oligarchs defended in part was a lower-end middle-class bubble. A middle-class demon would appear here once every few years, and it would require Mistress Oligarch to deal with. If her husband was here, it would be his task normally. Such battles were tough and arduous, not to mention life-threatening. With what the Oligarch family had to go through, it was no wonder they were so obsessed with becoming more powerful through any means necessary. Still, it was a bit odd to Lionel that the Oligarch family had so much trouble with heirs. Their son-in-law was gone, but Lionel had never heard anything about Athri's mother. Then there was the useless Athri herself. And in this generation they had to recruit dozens of boys who clearly weren't of oligarch blood to save them? Something was definitely fishy, something that obviously wasn't described or detailed in their library. Lionel wasn't surprised though. Why would leave such a secret in such an easily accessible place? Lionel could only shake his head. There was no use speculating. The four great families wanted to gather together the budding talents of each class and give them an opportunity. What this opportunity was, no one quite knew. But what they did know was that the Oligarch family was given 3 quotas. Mistress Oligarch wasted no time giving the first 2 to Sebastian and Slayton. That left just a single spot left for those that remained, a spot that she expected them all to fight for. It was no wonder why they were all so excited. Beneath those 2, the divisions of power beneath the Oligarch's family's potential son-in-laws were quite close. This meant that they all had an equal chance at claiming the final spot for themselves. Interesting, Lionel thought to himself. Originally, he wanted to just bide his time for the next week, then find time to escape once he had solidified his standing. But this seemed like an interesting opportunity, and it might help him gather what he needed to help everyone escape this zone faster. With that thought, Lionel had already decided that he would show however much strength he needed to claim this final spot for himself. Clearly, Mistress Oligarch already expected him to do so. If it wasn't for his rudeness, she might have directly given it to him to begin with. This battle will be a battle royale. Fights against demons will never be organized, and when in their world you must always remain alert. Show me you awareness and resourcefulness. Clear the grounds, she bellowed. The elders, Mistress Oligarch, and the mischievous Athri all moved back, giving the 20 or so young men who remained enough space to battle. Just as she was about to signal the start, Sebastian suddenly spoke again. You had such a powerful breakthrough into the 6th star, and you're equally as arrogant. I hope that you don't disappoint me. Sebastian's words seemed like he was levying a challenge toward Lionel, but what he was really doing was reminding everyone of the forcefulness of Lionel's breakthrough. At that moment, a realization came over the other young men. They had felt that their odds were relatively equal before, but remembering what had happened the last couple weeks, they felt that they had almost missed something huge. Their greatest threat might very well be this young man they knew so little about. On top of that, Mistress Oligarch had actually tolerated his disrespect and didn't say anything. With the mistress temper, they would have been skinned alive for less. Suddenly, several intents locked onto Lionel. Mistress Oligarch didn't say a word, but her gaze flickered with amusement. She still expected Lionel to win, but making him work harder wasn't a bad result either. He just might restrain himself a bit. Begin. Her voice descended as she signaled the start of the battle. However, what they didn't notice until this moment was that Lionel's hands were still lazily in his pockets, a light smile on his face. Even as a wave of young men suddenly surged toward him, he only light raised his foot and pressed it down. At that moment, a wave of blue energy rippled out like a tsunami. When it cleared, the only one who remained standing was Lionel. Well, there were others standing as well, about 20 ice statues worth. Chapter 1534. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 42 seconds p.m. Chapter 1534. Bronze. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel sat in silence, his legs crossed and his mind focused as though he relished in an awkward atmosphere. Currently, the group was on the back of an enormous flying bird, likely the largest creature that Lionel had ever seen with a wingspan of at least 50 meters. There were 3 boxes strapped to the back of this bird in a line down its spine, and one of these boxes was shared by Lionel, Slayton and Sebastian. Of his interactions with these people, all of them had been hostile. First he had a clash with Slayton about the unicorn demon corpse. And then there was the clash with Sebastian twice regarding things that were quite frankly small matters in Lionel's eyes. Slayton was an odd one. He continued to smile and hum as though nothing at all had happened. He had even pleasantly chatted with Lionel earlier as though he couldn't remember a thing. Though to his surprise, Lionel seemed able to smile and talk as though nothing at all had happened as well. Something that was quite rare among youths his age that he had met. The one who was truly making the atmosphere awkward was Sebastian, whose temper was nowhere near as amiable. He seemed to want to swallow Lionel alive, but unfortunately there wasn't much he could do at all. If he killed Lionel, he wouldn't just be fulfilling his wish, but he would be offending Mistress Olidark. If the Olidark family showed up without 3 seeds, what would the people say? The prestige of a family was far too important. It saved them from a lot of the infighting that might happen. Even if those that challenged you were ants and easily dealt with, if you constantly had to deal with such things again and again and again, then it would eventually wear down your resources as a family. As such, prestige and looking impregnable, at least from the outside, was very important. It saved the family experts resources and time. This way, you could put everything toward the real threats. Sebastian was an obedient dog of the Olidarks. How could he not place their well-being first? Right this moment, though, Lionel didn't care much about Sebastian's state of might. He was more so thinking about the size of this bird. Just how could such a large creature exist? There were too many secrets about this world that he still didn't understand. He had been in a mythological zone before, and though it took some liberties with the creation of its own version of the demon race, it was nothing like this. Of course, the Camelot zone had been much lower class and level, but Lionel wasn't sure if this was enough to explain things. He had met 6th-dimensional creatures before. He had even fought them. They were still the size of normal animals, give or to a few meters. But dozens of meters like this? That was too exaggerated. Lionel, if you don't mind me asking, what's your 4-star? Slayton's eyes shone as he looked toward Lionel. Mine is related to water force as well, so we're somewhat destined in that regard. My 4-star is the sacred water star. 4-star was the term people in this world used to refer to their affinities. Usually, if they had a strong affinity for an element, it would be born within their stars at birth, thus the reason for the name. The sacred water star, or rather sacred water force, was a water and light force fusion. It wasn't a true state force, but it couldn't be considered bad as well. It was ranked about similarly to the Luxnix family's snow force on the light force rankings, and on the water force rankings, it was ranked around the 60s to 70s. It was quite good, but nowhere near the best. Lionel smiled. If he were to tell the truth, he would say Void Star Force, but he obviously couldn't do that. Of course, this wouldn't exactly be the truth either, since he had forced this force star into existence. Instead, Lionel replied, Dark Ice. Slayton's brows jumped. This wasn't because Lionel's 4-star was powerful, but rather because it was the direct opposite. Dark Ice Force combined Water Force and Dark Force, which was nice. But it was nowhere near top 100 in Dark Forces, and it didn't crack the top 100 in Water Force either. This made sense, of course. The Dark Ice ore that Lionel used to form the foundation for this was a 5th-dimensional ore. It was only made somewhat more powerful by Lionel fusing it with evolution ores. Since it could naturally exist in a 5th-dimensional state, its power was definitely lacking. This was why Slayton was so shocked. How could such a low-level force possibly create such a strong effect? Slayton couldn't help but inwardly narrow his eyes. Was Lionel lying to him? Or was he telling the truth and had other secrets? Sebastian snorted at that moment, clearly taking the opportunity to look down on Lionel. Even if he had thought of what Slayton had, so what? It made him feel better to do things like this. What these two didn't know was that any force in a large enough quantity and concentration could have miraculous effects. Under the boost given to his water force affinity by his 2 newly formed stars, the amount of dark ice force Lionel could use was astronomical. Weak or not, When it was concentrated to a point, even a powerful enemy would suffer. At that moment, the three felt the bird descending with great speed. Just minutes later, it touched the ground, jolting the box carriage they sat in. By a tacit agreement, the three stood all at once, stepping out to be hit with a wall of noise. All sorts of creatures and people could be found around, each seemingly from another middle-class power, and many with strengths that made even Sebastian's brow furrow. Up ahead, there was a city with enormous bronze walls that towered hundreds of meters into the sky. It almost felt as though a giant had dropped a brass ring into an ant colony, and now they were all forced to look up at it in awe. There was no doubt that this was their destination, the location even a bird with a 50-meter wingspan hadn't dared fly into. Chapter 1535. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 1535. Fardan. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's eyes sparkled. The last time he had felt this level of awe was when he faced the gates of the Void Palace. Though he could only remember feeling it 4 times in his lifetime. The first time was when he faced the walls of Valiant City. The second time was when he saw the capital of Earth. The third time was when he laid eyes on the vital star of the dimensional cleanse, Trial. And the final was, of course, when he saw the Void Palace. Lionel had seen a lot by now and it took greater and greater feats to shock him. But this definitely met the necessary criteria. Maltalia? Ho, I didn't expect that your oligarch family would actually show its face. A chuckling hoarse feminine voice caught Lionel's attention, but he didn't bother to look over. It was clear that this person had ill will for the oligarch family, or maybe there was a rivalry of sorts, but Lionel didn't care about the face or prestige of the oligarch family, and he certainly wouldn't be stepping in to help them protect it. Regardless of Lionel's reaction, though, an older woman sauntered over, wearing a dress that was maybe much too modern for her age. It clung to her chest, hips and waist, leading down to a slit that revealed her right leg and the tall heels she was wearing. Though, despite the fact her style of dress didn't quite match her age, one had to admit that she was still quite the beauty all things considered. Despite the clearly venomous words she was speaking, her smile was still elegant and refined as 3 youths followed to her back. While Lionel didn't pay much attention to the interaction, he did take a look at where they had come from. However, when he didn't find anything of interest outside of another oversized beast, he turned back. If it wasn't for the fact he needed to be registered with the oligarch family, he would have long since left. Mistress Oligarch, or rather Maltalia, turned an indifferent gaze over. However, her granddaughter was just as disappointing as usual. Unable to hide her emotions, Afri couldn't help but snarl when she saw who was coming over, her every reaction being written on her sleeve. The truth was that the departure of her grandfather and father was related to these people. While fighting against the demons was a burden everyone shared, it was just the nature of humans to look out for their own interests first. They had their own families to protect, their own lands, their own resources. They wouldn't easily leave their territory, unless they were forced to. Such a thing was usually decided on a rotation, or by a lottery where the winner was actually the loser. In addition to this, there were, of course, some placements that were better than others. Years ago, it was under the machination of this Fardan family that the 2 pillars of the oligarch family were shipped away to a high-class bubble that was being overrun. Since then they hadn't been heard from. The interference between clashing points in space and bubbles made it difficult to communicate over long distances, especially when it was a separation between a large divide like middle and high class. The only family that didn't seem to have any limits on their communication at all were the 4 great families. Kivire Fardan chuckled when she saw Afri's reaction, a girl to her back looking toward the useless heiress with a look of clear derision. Words probably couldn't explain how much she looked down upon this flower in a vase. "We don't welcome you here, you may leave." Mistress Oligarch had, at first, planned to display nonchalance and indifference, but her granddaughter's reaction made keeping that facade difficult. As such, she could only calmly say these words. However, it was as though Mistress Fardan hadn't heard them at all. Maltalia, I see you've come within quite a few weeks. I assume that your precious granddaughter is participating? Athri's expression wavered with some apprehension. Not only did she know that the answer was no, but she actually showed a hint of fear at the prospect. It was hard to imagine that there could be a woman more useless. Who is participating for my Olidark family has nothing to do with you. Mistress Olidark was beginning to lose her patience, but Mistress Fardan only continued to laugh lightly. So these boys? I remember that your family's men didn't have strong seeds, so they could only birth weak women. So these must be the new recruits you've scrounged up? A few more impotent orphans to birth more weak women for your family? How long do you think that cycle can continue? Mistress Olidark's expression darkened. Sebastian looked as though his head was about to fly from his shoulders when he heard this, but Slayton continued to smile without a word. He didn't seem to be capable of reacting with anything else. At that moment, Lionel yawned. Are we going to stand here all day? This conversation is boring. For maybe the first time, Mistress Olidark felt grateful for words Lionel had spoken. Boring indeed, she said lightly. You three enter the city now. The hopes of the Olidark family will be on your shoulders. Kavire seemed to finally shift from her baseline, her gaze shifting toward Lionel. But he never looked at her from start to finish. The young heiress of the Fardan family, Vaura, narrowed her eyes when she looked at Lionel, but by that point, he and the others were already moving toward the city. At the same time, Mistress Olidark, her granddaughter and the elders had already eagerly returned to the large bird, prepared to leave for a new destination. Vaura. Yes, grandmother. Kill the three of them when there's an opportunity. You two support her. Yes, mistress. Kiver's eyes narrowed. There was something odd about that boy. It was best to kill him while he was still in the beginning stages of the 6th star. As for the other two, the hate between the Fardan and Olidarks was already irreconcilable. It was best to cripple their next generation entirely. Chapter 1536. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 1536. Shock and silence. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The inside of the city was unlike what Lionel had expected. Or it was more accurate to say that this so-called gathering was completely unlike what he expected. He could sense several force arts in the surroundings designed purely for monitoring. This meant that they were being watched from all sides. Lionel concluded that since Mistress Olidark and the others hadn't followed them into the city, they were using this method instead to check for progress. Lionel had expected a tournament of some sort, but what he got instead was probably akin to hell on earth. When they entered the city, they found themselves enveloped by a bubble of energy. All around them was what looked like a normal city with stores, residences, and even sky rises. However, the issue was that all of these things were surrounded by demons. Every group that entered the city was given a protective bubble of energy, and could only watch in horror as large numbers of demons tried to scratch and claw at them, only to fail. It suddenly became very obvious that this protective bubble, and the tall city walls didn't exist to protect those from the outside from coming in. Rather, it was the exact opposite. They were designed to keep these demons in. In fact, when Lionel turned back, he couldn't even see the city walls any longer. Just like when he had entered the demon world, it was as though he had entered an all-new space completely separate from the outside world. At that moment, an automated message played in Lionel's mind explaining the proceedings. Then, with an unceremonious pop, his energy bubble vanished, and he was dropped into a sea of demons. Lionel raised an eyebrow as several demons swept at him. They were clearly only low-class demons and didn't pose much of a threat to him, but there were several others around Lionel who were instantly overwhelmed, being unceremoniously shredded to pieces. Lionel dodged out of the way of a claw and stepped forward at the same time. His arm shot forward parallel to the arm of a wolf-man demon, and his fingers tapped its forehead. In one moment, the wolf-man was just fine, but in the next, its head was shredded to pieces. It was as though Lionel didn't need to try to kill low-class demons in the slightest. The strongest demon Lionel had faced until this point was the unicorn demon, and it was a middle low-class demon. Back then, he had been forced to use 30% of strength. And against the lower low-class demons, he probably had to use 10%. Now against the lower low-class demon, he didn't even have to bring out his spear, let alone use so much strength. According to the voice that Lionel had just heard, the city was actually divided into bubble classes. Because they were middle-class participants, they were directly transported to the middle-class region. This city was filled with nothing but participants, and demons were their currency. Only by killing demons could they buy safety, rest, food, and resources. In addition, if they performed extremely well, rather than just making enough to survive until the time period, they could exchange exactly this currency they had made for special prizes that would bolster their strength. The names of the participants would be ranked on a leaderboard, and the cities with the best performing triplet teams would gain prizes directly from the 4 great families. These were the rewards the cities and the families that controlled them were most looking forward to. These prizes would include relief from the great families, immunity from lottery draws to be drafted to needed areas, and a larger quota of resources for the next coming years. It was the first time that the 4 great families were doing such a thing, but even if it was the first time, it made those hopefuls no less wanting. It was no wonder Mistress Olidark was willing to swallow her grievances and put forward the best candidates. If she could bring her husband and son-in-law back home, then suffering a small bit of disrespect from Lionel wasn't a big deal at all. Lionel's eyes glowed. As expected, this was a great opportunity. The prizes the cities would get weren't intriguing to him. After all, they were designed to only be useful to large powers to begin with. The prizes that he could earn himself by using and spending his demon points was a different matter entirely. Lionel completely ignored Slayton and Sebastian, not even trying to team up with them like the other groups had. He had no interest in such things, they would only drag him down. In addition, there was very clearly a hidden rule here that most would be eyeing. Killing demons would get your demon points, but so would killing those with the demon points to begin with. Lionel had no way of knowing what Mistress Olidark had secretly whispered into their ears, but he had no plans to give his back to these people to protect. Lionel didn't believe for an instant that Mistress Olidark had left him in the dark about the rules by accident. Lionel's absolute spear domain flourished to life, shredding apart every demon that stepped without 5 meters of him. His pace of killing was mind-numbing. In just a few seconds, he had already left those that had spawned with him in the dust. There was something else about these rules that greatly intrigued Lionel, as his ranking quickly shot up. It emphasized that he had been spawned into the middle-class region. Did that mean that there was a chance to exchange his demon points to enter a higher region? And if there was, he had a feeling that there would be even better prizes to exchange for there. In a location high in the sky, floating in a cloud above, a gathering of elders, family heads and organization heads came together. Several leaderboards could be seen and various groups found their own, and intently focused on it. Best on the side, several screens of live action played, but they mostly focused on high rankers or interesting life and death situations. When the new arrivals came, without pause, they all moved forward to greet the same man sitting high on a throne. He had a head of vibrant blue hair and just as blue eyes, his aura wafting outward in suffocating waves. Everything about his air screams majestic and mighty, not to mention impregnable. Mistress Olidark bowed lowly and paid her respects. After a few seconds she raised her head and turned away. The man never acknowledged any of them, but this was already to be expected. What wasn't expected, though, was that if Lionel was here he would have been shocked and silent. His mind would spin, unable to quite compute what he was seeing. Whether it was the hair, the eyes, even down the exact aura, this man was a perfect replica. It was impossible for it to be a coincidence. But the question was, what was a member of the Aderna family of Earth doing in a mythological zone like this? Chapter 1537. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1537. Next victim. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. There were over 30,000 participants in the middle class sector from over 10,000 cities, families and organizations. Maybe it was because the great families didn't care for the lower classes all that much, or maybe they just couldn't be bothered to care about perfect fairness. But Lionel and the others had only entered after already about 80% of the coming participants had done so. Even so, in just a few seconds, Lionel leapt through thousands of ranks from lower than 32,000, all the way up to 19,000. He wasn't the first to have such an enormous leap among the middle classes, but this was still large enough of a leap to cause one of the mini monitors to suddenly focus on him. Mistress Olidark and the others who were paying a great amount of attention to the middle class immediately spotted this. But when they saw that Lionel was alone, unlike most of the others, their expressions immediately became ugly. This was the middle class sector. Even though the front was loaded with lower class demons, it wouldn't remain like this for long. Very quickly, Lionel would run into middle lower class demons and higher. Eventually, true middle-class demons would appear, and a single group wouldn't be enough. Mistress Olidark's face went completely dark. She knew why Lionel had done this. He didn't trust Sebastian or Slayton. It wasn't that she hadn't thought of this possibility, but she thought that in choosing between a potential risk to his life and a certain death, Lionel would choose the former. Anyone would choose the former. It seemed, though, that she had underestimated Lionel's stubbornness. Things would still be fine if only Lionel died, but now that he was gone it left the other two vulnerable. It was very likely that because of one Lionel, her whole Olidark family would be ruined. Back in the sector, Sebastian and Slayton were already gritting their teeth. Even the usually calm and smiling Slayton had a gaze that dimmed a considerable amount. They had tried to call out to Lionel, but it was as though he hadn't heard a single word they said. The unfortunate truth was that Lionel was right to directly ignore them. Mistress Olidark had already informed them that once the events died down and they secured a safe house, that they were to find a chance to directly kill Lionel and take his point. In fact, Slayton had put in a little extra effort to get closer to Lionel as well during the ride here. However, neither expected that Lionel would disregard his own safety to spite them. It was like Lionel was dragging them toward death. If he was going to die, then they could all die together. Sebastian and Slayton both turned serious as they felt a subtle trio of gazes land on them. They didn't need to look over to know that it was the Fardan family participants. The two were still talents in their own rights, and they immediately understood the situation they were in. They didn't even dare to allow the Fardans to realize they had noticed their intent, feigning ignorance. It was best to remain as far away from open hostility until they could settle down. Their gazes flashed with a cold light as they looked off toward where Lionel had disappeared before buckling down and fending off the wave of demons. They weren't as foolish as Lionel. They knew how important it was to conserve their strength. Lionel shot through the demons, his spear force shredding everything in its path. He could already guess what all of them were thinking, but he didn't mind it. In fact, he found it a bit amusing. Stamina? With how well his vital stars and dream force stars worked now, he would probably grow bored of even a life and death struggle before his stamina gave way. Plus, even if that wasn't the case, he was hardly using any of his strength right now, which also meant that Mistress Olidark's worries about middle-class demons would also fall on deaf ears. Lionel's goal wasn't even this place. If the middle-class sector didn't have what he needed, he would kill enough demons to exchange a pass to enter the high-class sector. If that wasn't enough, he would enter the human-class sector. As far as he was concerned, there was nothing here that could threaten him. At the same time, this place was also the opportunity he needed to finish the final stretch of the 2 weeks that remained of his plans ahead of schedule, so he didn't even care much about revealing a bit more of his strength either. Regardless, after he left this place, he wouldn't be returning to the Olidark family. 1 point per 5 lower low-class demons, 1 per 2 middle low-class demons, and 1 per higher low-class demon. The numbers could get annoying. It would be better to target middle-class demons. P1E's visiti nov 1 bien. NE. T there was a huge jump for middle-class demons, 10 demon points for lower, 100 for middle, and 1,000 for higher. That was where the big money was. And it was also probably why Lionel's jump in rankings was so slow after he crossed below the 20,000 mark. Ah, that's where you've been hiding. A smile spread across Lionel's face as he spotted his first middle-class demon. Those that had been watching in a cloud above the city wore weird expressions. Many who had a relationship with the Olidark family had already made the connection since the name Lionel Olidark was on display for all to see. Those who had good relationships with the family looked toward the mistress with pitying expressions, but many more laughed and sneered. Didn't it show a lack of foresight to allow such a youth to participate in such an important event? But it wasn't long before those smiles froze. Lionel shot toward the low-middle-class demon like a bulldozer. He didn't even levy an attack, just letting his absolute spear domain rip it apart. Flesh worth its weight in gold fell to the ground in a rain, but Lionel didn't seem to care about it in the slightest. He shot forward, looking for his next victim as though nothing had happened. Chapter 1538. Published at 27th of January, 2023, 12:33 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 1538. Sky rises if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Mistress Olidark stood frozen. After a long while, she released a self-deprecating laugh. She realized right then that one way or another, the Olidark family was finished. She had underestimated Lionel. With this level of talent, how could the Morales family not have been at least a high-class family? In that case, so long as Lionel rose high enough, he would catch the attention of the enemies that had destroyed it. Once they saw the name Olidark, even if they didn't act now, in the future her family would find itself facing an unknown behemoth. Even if by some miracle Lionel passed under the radar, overperforming to this extent would net him too much power. With Lionel's personality, he would hesitate to betray them and come back in the future for revenge. And to make matters even worse, even if Lionel was still overestimating himself and he ended up dying, Sebastian and Slayton weren't far from following in his footsteps. One way or another, no matter how she flipped and analyzed it, they were finished. Lionel zipped around, finding every middle-class demon he could and shredding them to pieces. His ranking continued to shoot up by large strides, from 19,000 to 15,000, and then from 15,000 to 12,000. It had only been several minutes since he entered, but he had already accumulated over 300 demon points. This city is so large, it feels like a world of its own. Before I make any other moves, I should check these shops to see what's going on. Lionel chose a random shop, blasted the demons around away and tried to enter. Immediately, he was greeted with a message. It told him the level of the shop, the entry fee, and how long he could stay inside. This was the lowest level shop, but it still cost 3 demon points just to enter. You would have to kill 15 lower class demons, just for the right to enter a low-level shop for 15 minutes. It could be said that this was definitely a hell on earth. If Lionel had entered this place before entering the 6th dimension, he would definitely be struggling with these requirements. It required so much just to enter, so how much would the things inside cost? The first shop Lionel entered was actually an exchange. It could convert demon corpses into force pills that could have a myriad of effects. Some gave temporary boosts in strength, some healed injuries, and some could have small but permanent effects on your power. P1Es visiti nov1 bien. N.E.T. This was just the lowest level shop, so it could only do this for low-class demons. Lionel exited the shop after he was done and continued on his killing spree until he found another to enter, checking them all one by one. As he entered these shops, Lionel's rank didn't fall. If one had to choose between spending their points or hoarding them, there wouldn't be much of a benefit to families. Instead, spent points and hoarded points split into 2 categories. At the end of the event, hoarded points would be increased by 50% while spent points would be worth the same. That was the only incentive to hoard your points. That said, most would choose to spend when they had a chance in the beginning to strengthen themselves as much as possible, and then during the final days go all out to gather as many hoarded points as possible. After an analysis, Lionel split the shop into several categories. The first shop was a conversion-type shop, essentially helping one to gain even more benefits from their demon hunting. The second shop type was the weapon shop, the third was the technique shop, the fourth was resource shops, and the final was the healing shop. These were all the lowest class though. As Lionel moved up, he finally crossed a threshold. Not only were there more middle-class demons, but this was the point where residents, or safe houses, appeared. The lowest level of safe house only allowed you to enter and rest for a certain period of time. The higher the class, the more benefits and amenities there were. Many provided food. At a higher level they doubled as healing shops. And at the highest, they even came with large concentrations of force that allowed you to increase your strength. This final level, though, was only left to the sky rises in the distance, which would be considered Lionel's main goal. The resource shops that Lionel had seen until now didn't have anything that moved them. They had low-class herbs and ores, but nothing on the list of things Lionel needed. The last chance Lionel had were the sky rises. If they didn't have it, he would definitely need to buckle down and gather the 100,000 demon points he would need to enter the high class. By the time Lionel made it, he had already entered the top 1,000, forcing the middle-class leaders into a state of numbness as they stared ahead. However, the higher he climbed, the more despair Mistress Olidark felt. She sank into her seat, her face a ghastly sheen of white and her wrinkled hands trembling. A lack of stamina? Even after an hour Lionel hadn't sweat even a single bead. Worry about middle-class demons? Shouldn't they be worried about him? Everything from earlier seemed so laughable. Lionel shot into the first sky rise, paying the 1,000 demon point fee and gaining a day-long entry. He looked around, finding several gazes suddenly landing on him. The elite of the middle-class cities were surprised by a new entry, especially since they didn't recognize who he was. But Lionel didn't care for them even a bit. He was on a time crunch. This event wouldn't last forever, so he had to do his best with the time he had. Without hesitation, he entered the first shop, his gaze sharpening as he scanned the items one by one. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.